The last person to see 5-month-old Ames Glover alive was the one person who should have protected him. And for 35 years, the truth of what happened in those 20 minutes on a cold February evening has remained locked behind a wall of silence so impenetrable that even the screaming absence of a child could not break it. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we are exploring for unsettling stories where appearances concealed something far darker. Take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the vanishing of Ames Glover. Now let's begin. Monday, February 5th, 1990, 6:45 p.m. The call came into the Metropolitan Police from a phone box on the Hamilton estate in Southall, West London. The voice on the other end belonged to 28-year-old Paul Glover, and his words would set in motion one of the most disturbing and controversial missing child investigations in British history. "My son," he said, his accent carrying the rhythms of his native Ghana. "He's gone. Someone took him from my car." If you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. The evening air in Southall carried the mingled scents of curry spices from the dozens of Indian restaurants lining South Road, exhaust fumes from the steady stream of traffic, and the damp chill of approaching rain. It was an ordinary Monday in this bustling suburb of West London, where the streets thrummed with life even as darkness fell. Ordinary, that is, until Paul Glover discovered that the back seat of his blue Ford Sierra, registration CLP 655Y, was empty. Where 5-month-old Ames Glover had been sleeping just 20 minutes earlier, there was now only absence. The baby's blue and yellow coat, the light green baby grow, the tiny blue boots, all gone. The child's seat remained, still strapped in place. The car doors, Paul insisted, were still locked when he returned. No broken glass, no jimmied locks, no signs of forced entry whatsoever, just a vanished child. As the first police units converged on South Road at the junction with Hamilton Road, the critical countdown had already begun. In cases of child abduction, every second is measured in steadily diminishing hope. The first hour is golden. The first 24 hours are crucial. After 48 hours, the statistics become a parent's nightmare made manifest. Detective Constable Sarah Mitchell was among the first responders, arriving at 7:03 p.m., 18 minutes after the initial call. She would later testify that the scene struck her as wrong from the very beginning, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Paul Glover stood beside his vehicle, visibly agitated, hands moving as he explained what had happened. But his eyes, Mitchell noted this in her initial report, kept darting away from the back seat, as if unable to bear looking at the empty space where his son should have been. "Walk me through it again," Mitchell said, her notepad already filling with details that would be scrutinized for decades to come. From the beginning, Paul's account was straightforward. He had been caring for Ames for the weekend, though he and the baby's mother, 22-year-old Shanika Ondaatje, had separated months earlier. Their marriage, hastily arranged a month after Ames was born on August 21, 1989, had crumbled under the weight of youth, incompatibility, and circumstances neither had been prepared for. Shanika was living in a hostel in Greenford, trying to build a new life. Paul had custody of Ames for the evening. He had driven to Southall around 6:25 p.m. with a simple plan: withdraw money from the Lloyds Bank cash point on South Road, then pick up a takeaway curry from Quality, a popular local restaurant. Ames was asleep in his child's seat in the back. Paul claimed he locked all the doors before walking the short distance to the cash machine. "How long were you gone?" Mitchell asked. 20 minutes, maybe 15. I went to the cash machine first, then to Quality for the food. When I came back," his voice cracked, the car was still locked. Everything looked the same, but Ames was gone. Mitchell looked at the Ford Sierra. South Road was not a quiet street. Even now, at 7 in the evening, pedestrians walked past, cars crawled through traffic, shop fronts blazed with light. Someone would have seen something, a man breaking into a car, person carrying a baby. Someone would have noticed. Did you see anyone near your car? Anyone at all? Paul shook his head. No one. Nothing. By 7:30 p.m., more officers had arrived. The scene was cordoned off, though the car had not been processed yet. That would come later, in the harsh fluorescent lights of the forensic garage, where technicians would dust every surface for fingerprints and find nothing. No evidence of forced entry, no unknown prints, no proof that anyone other than Paul Glover had touched his vehicle. Shanika Ondaatje received the news at the hostel in Greenford. She would later describe the moment as feeling like the ground opened up beneath me. One moment she was a young mother worried about making ends meet, about finding permanent housing, about navigating the complications of a failed marriage. The next moment, she was the mother of a missing child, stepping into a nightmare that would never end. She arrived at Southall Police Station at 9:17 p.m., her face a mask of barely controlled panic. Detective Inspector Robert Hammond, now leading the investigation, questioned her gently but thoroughly. Every missing child case begins with the family, with the uncomfortable truth that most harm to children comes from those closest to them. When did you last see Ames? Hammond asked. Friday afternoon. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as they gripped a tissue. Paul was supposed to bring him back Saturday, but he asked for one more day. I said yes. I thought. She broke off, tears finally breaking through. I thought one more day wouldn't matter. Hammond's questioning revealed details that would later be dissected by media and public alike. Ames had been on an at-risk register with social services, not uncommon for infants born to young, separated parents in difficult circumstances, but a detail that would be weaponized against both Shanika and Paul in the court of public opinion. The parents' estrangement, Shanika's Sri Lankan background, Paul's Ghanaian origins, the hostile living situation, all of it would be fed to the media in a way that many later argued ensured the case never received the attention it deserved. Did Paul seem normal when he picked up Ames? Hammond asked. Shanika considered the question carefully. He seemed stressed, but Paul always seemed stressed lately. He was having trouble at work, money problems. But he loved Ames. Whatever else was wrong, he loved our son. Back on South Road, the investigation was expanding with methodical urgency. Officers were conducting door-to-door inquiries, speaking to shopkeepers, residents, anyone who might have been on the street between 6:25 and 6:45 p.m. The quality restaurant staff confirmed that Paul Glover had come in to collect food. The manager checked the receipt. 6:38 p.m. The cash point at Lloyd's Bank had no camera, but bank records would later confirm a withdrawal at 6:31 p.m. The timeline seemed to hold. Paul had been gone approximately 15 to 20 minutes, just as he'd claimed. But no one, not a single witness among the dozens interviewed that night and in the days to come, reported seeing a baby in Paul Glover's car. No one saw anyone break into the vehicle. No one saw anyone carrying an infant away from South Road that evening. It was as if Ames Glover had simply ceased to exist. Detective Inspector Hammond stood on South Road as midnight approached, watching the forensic team work under portable lights. The temperature had dropped, and a fine mist was beginning to fall. He thought about the baby, 5 months old, dressed in a light green baby grow and a blue and yellow coat. Where was he now? Cold? Frightened? Or was he already past fear, past cold, past everything? The first 5 hours had passed. The investigation was moving quickly, but Hammond had been in law enforcement long enough to know that in cases like this, when a child vanished without witnesses, without evidence, without any trail to follow, those first hours were everything. And they were already gone. As dawn broke over London, Paul Glover was brought in for formal questioning. The interview room was small, windowless, smelling of stale coffee and decades of desperate conversations. Across the table, Hammond and Detective Sergeant Linda Chun watched Paul carefully. They had been up all night, running on adrenaline and the driving need to find answers before it was too late. If it wasn't already too late. Let's go through it again, Mr. Glover, Hammond said. His voice was calm, professional, but his eyes were hard. Every detail, everything you remember about yesterday evening. Paul's story remained consistent. He had parked on South Road, locked the car, gone to the cash machine, then to Quality, then returned to find Ames missing. He had rushed to the Hamilton estate to call police. The car had still been locked. How is that possible, Paul? Chun leaned forward. How does someone take a baby from a locked car without breaking in? Without anyone seeing? I don't know, Paul said, and for the first time, his composure cracked completely. I don't know. I don't understand any of this. The interrogation continued for hours. Paul's account never wavered, but neither did the investigators' suspicion. The statistics were clear and brutal. In cases where children disappeared under mysterious circumstances, family members were involved more than 75% of the time. A locked car with no signs of forced entry. No witnesses. A baby who simply vanished. At 11:30 a.m., Paul Glover was arrested on suspicion of child abduction. The news would spread quickly, and with it, the media circus would begin in earnest. But even as Paul sat in a holding cell, even as his home was searched, his belongings examined, his life dissected, no evidence emerged. No proof of harm. No indication of what had happened to Ames. Paul would be released without charge 36 hours later, but the cloud of suspicion would never lift. 24 hours after Ames Glover disappeared, the investigation had expanded to involve over 50 officers. House-to-house inquiries had covered a half-mile radius around South Road. The Ford Sierra had been processed completely, revealing nothing. Roadblocks had been set up, vehicles checked. The media had begun to pick up the story, though coverage was notably muted compared to other missing child cases. Shanika Ondaatje sat in her hostel room, staring at one of the few photographs she had of Ames. In it, he was smiling, that gummy, wide-mouthed smile that babies give before teeth come in. His brown eyes, so like her own, seemed to look right at the camera, right at her. She had taken this photo just days before, never imagining it might become one of the last images she had of her son. The investigation had taken on a grim reality. Ames was 5 months old. He would need food, need changing, need care. Every hour that passed without finding him increased the likelihood that something terrible had already happened. Detective Inspector Hammond knew the statistics by heart. 76% of children who are abducted and murdered are killed within 3 hours. They were now at 24. The window for finding Ames alive was closing rapidly, if it hadn't already slammed shut. The morning briefing was somber. Over 200 tips had come in, each one followed up, each one leading nowhere. Officers were exhausted, running on coffee and determination, but the crushing weight of a case going cold was beginning to settle over the investigation. "We're missing something," Hammond said, staring at the incident board covered in photos, timelines, maps. A 5-month-old baby doesn't just disappear. Someone knows something. But the problem was starker than that. No one knew anything. Or if they did, they weren't talking. The forensic reports had come back on Paul Glover's car and clothing. Nothing. No blood. No signs of struggle. No evidence of anything untoward. His home had been searched. A small flat in North London, modest but tidy. Ames's things were there: clothes, toys, nappies. 7 out of 10 nappies were still in the bag Paul had packed for the weekend. Why would he pack 10 nappies for a 2-day visit and leave with 7 still unused? It was a small detail, but it nagged at investigators. Had something happened to Ames before Monday evening? Had Paul been driving around with an empty child seat, building an alibi, constructing a story about an impossible abduction? Or had an opportunistic predator really managed to break into a locked car on a busy street, steal a baby, and vanish without a single witness? As the critical 48-hour mark passed, the investigation shifted. The immediate, frantic search was giving way to something more methodical, more grinding. This was no longer a rescue operation. This was a murder investigation without a body. Day 3, February 8, 1990. The first public appeal was made on the morning of the third day. Detective Inspector Hammond stood before a bank of cameras and microphones, Shanika Ondaatje beside him, her face pale and drawn but composed. Behind them, a large photograph of Ames smiled out at the assembled press. That same gummy grin, those bright eyes. Ames Glover has been missing for over 60 hours, Hammond began. He is 5 months old, biracial, with brown hair and brown eyes. He was last seen wearing a blue and yellow coat, light green baby grow, blue and yellow hat, and blue boots. Hammond described the circumstances of the disappearance. The locked car on South Road, the 20-minute window, the complete absence of witnesses. He appealed for anyone with information to come forward. Then Shanika spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the silent room. "Please," she said, "if you have my son, please bring him back. He needs his mother. He needs." She faltered, then continued, "I just need to know he's safe. Please." The appeal was broadcast across Britain. Photographs of Ames appeared in newspapers. Posters went up throughout Southall and surrounding areas. The hotline rang constantly, and yet nothing substantial emerged. The investigation had interviewed over 300 people in the first 3 days. Shopkeepers on South Road, residents of the Hamilton estate, regular customers at Quality, staff at the bank. Each interview was documented, cross-referenced, analyzed. A team of analysts pored over Paul Glover's financial records, phone records, every scrap of his life looking for some indication of planning, of motive, of guilt. They found a man struggling financially, stressed by separation and single fatherhood, but nothing that suggested he had harmed his son. Nothing that explained what had happened to Ames. Week 1, February 12, 1990. By the end of the first week, the investigation had expanded to include over 500 interviews. Every aspect of Paul and Shanika's lives had been examined. Social services records revealed that Ames had been placed on an at-risk register, a precautionary measure given his parents' youth and separation, but not an indication of any specific threat. The media coverage, however, seized on this detail with disturbing enthusiasm. The narrative began to shift. This wasn't a missing child story like the ones that typically gripped Britain, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed children from stable middle-class families. This was a biracial baby, born to young, separated parents, one living in a hostel, the child on an at-risk register. Philip Hencher would later write in The Independent that it was harder to make a good story out of a missing black child than out of one with blonde hair and blue eyes. The observation was stark but accurate. Coverage of Ames's disappearance, while present, never reached the fever pitch of other missing child cases. The public appeals, while earnest, never generated the massive outpouring of assistance that other families received. Shanika Ondaatje watched the coverage with growing bitterness. Her son was missing, possibly dead, and the media seemed more interested in dissecting her failed marriage and living situation than in finding Ames. "It's like he doesn't matter," she told Detective Hammond during one interview. "Because of who we are, where we come from, how we live, none of that should matter. He's a baby. He's my baby." Hammond had no good response. He had been in policing long enough to recognize the truth in her words, even if he couldn't change it. Week 2, February 19, 1990. Paul Glover filed a formal complaint against the Metropolitan Police, alleging assault and racial abuse during his detention. The complaint detailed hours of aggressive interrogation, accusations shouted in his face, treatment that he claimed crossed the line from investigation to harassment. The complaint was investigated by Internal Affairs and eventually dismissed, but it added another layer of controversy to an already complex case. Was Paul Glover a grieving father being scapegoated by overzealous police? Or was he a killer using accusations of racism to deflect from his own guilt? The truth, as always, was likely more complicated than either narrative suggested. The investigation had been aggressive because time was critical. Officers had pressed hard because they believed, and statistics supported, that Paul knew more than he was saying. But the investigation had also been colored by assumptions about young, separated, financially struggling parents of color. The intersection of urgency, suspicion, and unconscious bias had created a perfect storm. Meanwhile, the actual search for Ames continued. Specialized teams searched parks, waterways, construction sites, any location where a body might be concealed. Every abandoned building within a 5-mile radius was checked. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept the area. Divers searched the Grand Union Canal. They found nothing. Month 1, March 5, 1990. As the 1-month anniversary of Ames's disappearance approached, the investigation had consumed thousands of man-hours and generated little more than questions. Over 2,000 people had been interviewed. Every lead had been pursued. The file was thick with reports, statements, forensic analyses. All of it painting a picture of a child who had simply ceased to exist. The community in Southall had rallied initially, with volunteers distributing posters and organizing searches. But as weeks passed without progress, the energy dissipated. Life moved on as it always does. The story faded from the front pages, relegated to occasional updates that reported no new developments. For Shanika, time had stopped on February 5th at 6:45 p.m. Every day was the same, waking with the momentary forgetting that sometimes graces the newly bereaved, then the crushing return of reality. Ames was gone. No one knew where. No one knew what had happened. She existed in a limbo of grief without resolution, hope without foundation. She moved away from Greenford, unable to bear the place where she'd received the news. Her new location was kept private, a small concession to a woman whose life had been stripped bare by tragedy and media scrutiny. Month 3, May 1990. The investigation was officially downgraded from active to ongoing. Officers were reassigned to other cases. The incident room was dismantled. The files were boxed and stored. Ames Glover joined the grim statistical category of unresolved missing child cases. Detective Inspector Hammond had pushed as hard as he could, but without evidence, without witnesses, without even a clear theory of what had happened, there was nowhere left to go. The frustration gnawed at him. A child had disappeared, and he had no answers. Paul Glover had returned to his life as best he could, though suspicion clung to him like a shadow. He maintained his innocence, insisted he had no idea what had happened to his son, and lived with the knowledge that many people, perhaps most, believed he was lying. The theories multiplied in the absence of facts. Theory 1. Stranger abduction. Perhaps someone had been watching, waiting for an opportunity. Perhaps they had tools to unlock car doors quickly and quietly. Perhaps in those 20 minutes on a busy street, they had managed to take a baby without anyone noticing. It was possible, if statistically unlikely. Stranger abductions of infants were rare, and ones that occurred without any physical evidence or witnesses were rarer still. Theory 2. Paul's involvement. Perhaps something had happened to Ames earlier. An accident, a moment of frustration and violence, something Paul couldn't undo. Perhaps the story of the locked car and the disappearance was an elaborate cover-up. Perhaps Ames had never been in that car on South Road. Perhaps he was already dead, his body hidden somewhere, and the abduction was theater. Theory 3. Planned removal. Perhaps Ames had been taken by someone Paul knew, someone from his community, spirited away to Ghana or elsewhere. Perhaps the financial struggles and custodial stress had led Paul to make a terrible decision. To give Ames away, to remove him from the equation. Perhaps Ames was alive somewhere, growing up not knowing his real identity, while his mother grieved. Each theory had proponents. None had proof. October 2003. The reopening. 13 years after Ames Glover disappeared, Shanika Ondaatje, she had long since stopped using her married name, approached the Metropolitan Police with a simple request: please look again. Please don't let him be forgotten. Her persistence paid off. In October 2003, Scotland Yard's Racial and Violent Crimes Task Force formally reopened the investigation. The passage of time had brought new technologies. DNA analysis had advanced dramatically. Computer databases could cross-reference information in ways impossible in 1990, and cold case techniques had evolved. Detective Chief Superintendent Gordon Briggs was assigned to lead the reopened investigation. He was experienced in cold cases, skilled at looking at old evidence with fresh eyes. He began by reviewing every file, every interview, every piece of evidence from the original investigation. "We have a mother who does not know what happened to her child," Briggs said at a press conference announcing the reopening. 13 years is far too long to live without answers. We owe it to Shanika, and we owe it to Ames, to do everything possible to find the truth. A reward of £10,000 was offered for information leading to Ames's discovery. New appeals were issued, this time with age progression images created by forensic artists who specialized in projecting how missing children might look years later. The images showed a teenager with brown hair and eyes, a subtle blend of his parents' features. But the artists admitted the projections were speculative. At 5 months old, Ames's bone structure hadn't been developed enough for accurate age progression. The reopening generated new tips. The hotline rang again 13 years later. People reported seeing children who looked like the age progression images. Memories were refreshed. Grudges surfaced. Anonymous callers suggested looking into this person or that location. Each lead was investigated. Each one led nowhere. November 2003, the Ghana lead. Then came the tip that would send investigators to West Africa. An anonymous caller contacted the investigation team with specific information. Ames Glover had been taken to Ghana in 1990. The caller provided names, claimed to know people involved, insisted that Ames was alive and had been raised there. The lead was substantial enough that officers traveled to Ghana to investigate. They interviewed individuals named in the tip. They worked with local authorities to search areas where Ames supposedly had been taken. DNA samples were collected from 2 young men specifically identified as possibly being Ames. The tests came back negative. Neither was Ames Glover. The Ghana investigation yielded nothing concrete, but it reinforced a theory that had circulated for years. That Paul Glover had arranged for his son to be taken to his home country, that Ames was alive somewhere in West Africa, perhaps not even knowing his true identity. For Shanika, the trip to Ghana was both hope and heartbreak. Hope that Ames might be alive, might be found. Heartbreak when each lead evaporated. What should have been a truly precious period in the mother's life, watching her son growing up, taking his first steps, cutting his first teeth, speaking his first words, have all been taken away from her. Detective Briggs said at another press conference after returning from Ghana. "We hope old allegiances will not be the same and some people will come forward to tell us the truth." No one came forward. April 2004, Shanika's birthday message. On what would have been Ames's 14th birthday, August 21, 2004, Shanika gave an interview that laid bare the peculiar torture of unresolved loss. "I only have a few photographs of him," she said, her voice steady but her eyes distant. "That is how I remember him, but it is getting harder to remember. I look at the photos and I try to remember what he felt like in my arms, what his cry sounded like, the smell of his skin, and it's fading. He's fading, and that terrifies me more than anything." She spoke of the impossible hope that keeps parents of missing children suspended between grief and resolution. "I am desperately clinging to hope, but I need to know, even if it is bad news," she continued. "I wonder what he would be like if he was still alive. I sometimes look at children in that age group, mixed race like him, and I wonder, is that him? Could that be my son? It's torture, but I can't stop." The interview generated renewed public interest, but no new information. The case remained as impenetrably mysterious as ever. 2012. Another reopening, another appeal. On April 12, 2012, the Metropolitan Police once again formally reopened the investigation, coinciding with what would have been Ames's 22nd birthday. By now, Ames, if alive, would be a young man, perhaps graduating from university, perhaps starting a career, perhaps building a life of his own. The renewed investigation employed even more advanced techniques. Social media was utilized for appeals. Cold case databases were searched for similar unsolved crimes. Paul Glover, now in his 50s, was re-interviewed. He maintained, as he had for 22 years, that he had no idea what had happened to his son. The investigation reviewed every aspect of the original case, looking for anything that might have been missed, any connection that hadn't been made, any witness who might now be willing to talk. Once again, the effort generated attention but no breakthroughs. The mystery of Ames Glover remained unsolved. The racial disparity question. As the years passed, the Ames Glover case increasingly became a touchstone in discussions about racial disparity in media coverage and police resource allocation for missing persons cases. Experts pointed out the stark contrast between the coverage Ames received and that given to other missing children in the same era. While some missing white children became household names with massive searches, international media attention, and sustained public interest, Ames's case faded quickly from public consciousness. The reasons were complex. The circumstances of his disappearance, the separated parents, the at-risk register, the hostile living situation, all contributed to a narrative that didn't fit the innocent victim framework the media and public often demanded. But underlying these factors was an uncomfortable truth. Missing children of color, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds, simply didn't generate the same level of concern or resource commitment as their white counterparts. Shanika spoke about this disparity in multiple interviews over the years. If Ames had been a white baby from a stable family, she said in 2010, the whole country would have been looking for him. There would have been posters everywhere, constant news coverage, massive searches. But my son, he disappeared, and within weeks it was like he never existed. That's the reality. The observation was supported by data. Studies of missing persons cases consistently showed disparities in media coverage, police resources, and public interest based on the race and socio-economic status of the victims. Ames Glover's case was not an anomaly. It was part of a pattern. As February 5, 2020 marked 30 years since Ames Glover's disappearance, Shanika Ondaatje, now 52 years old, gave another interview. 3 decades of not knowing had etched themselves into her face, visible in the lines around her eyes and the weariness in her voice. I only have a few photographs of him. It is getting harder to remember, she admitted, echoing words she'd spoken many times before. The repetition itself spoke to the frozen nature of her grief. Stuck in that same moment, those same questions year after year. She had tried to move on with her life. She had built a career, found some measure of peace, created a life that existed outside the shadow of February 5, 1990. But there would always be a part of her trapped in that moment, waiting for a phone call, waiting for news, waiting for closure that never came. Although I have tried to move on, there will always be a part of me that cannot, she said. I need to know what happened to Ames. The case remained officially open. The files sat in storage at Scotland Yard, periodically reviewed but yielding no new insights. Technology had advanced dramatically since 1990, DNA analysis, facial recognition, digital forensics, social media tracking, but none of it could answer the fundamental question. What happened to Ames Glover on South Road, Southall, on February 5, 1990? After 3 decades, the theories had been refined, debated, and endlessly dissected, but none had been proven. The opportunistic abduction theory. This required believing that someone, in broad daylight on a busy street, managed to unlock a car, remove a baby, and vanish without a single witness. It required believing that this person had the means and motive to take an infant, and either killed Ames immediately or kept him alive all these years without anyone recognizing him from the age progression images distributed widely over the decades. The statistical probability was vanishingly small, but not impossible. Stranger abductions of infants did happen, if rarely. The lack of evidence could be explained by luck and careful planning. The absence of Ames's body could mean it had been well hidden or disposed of in a way that prevented discovery. But if this was what happened, it meant a predator had gotten away with the perfect crime. It meant Ames's disappearance was pure, terrible chance. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong 20 minutes. The parental involvement theory. This required believing that Paul Glover, either intentionally or through accident, had caused his son's death or disappearance and constructed an elaborate cover story. It required explaining how he disposed of a body so thoroughly that 30 years of searching never found a trace. It required accepting that he had maintained his innocence for 3 decades despite enormous pressure, suspicion, and scrutiny. The unused nappies nagged at investigators. 7 out of 10 remaining from a weekend visit suggested Ames hadn't been with Paul as long as claimed, or that something had happened before the supposed abduction. The lack of witnesses who saw Ames in the car that evening was troubling. The perfect timing, just enough time to create an alibi, not so much that the absence would be immediately obvious, seemed almost too convenient. But absent concrete evidence, this remained speculation. Paul had passed multiple interrogations, his life had been examined in microscopic detail, and nothing definitive had emerged linking him to harm. This required believing that Paul or someone in his community had arranged for Ames to be taken to Ghana, that the child was raised there under a different identity, that an elaborate conspiracy had held for 30 years without anyone breaking silence. The 2003 investigation in Ghana had found nothing, but West Africa was vast, and a child taken there in 1990 could have been anywhere. If Ames were alive and 30 years old, he might have built a life with no knowledge of his true origins. He might walk past his mother on a street and never know. This theory offered hope, the possibility that Ames was alive, but it also raised uncomfortable questions. Why? What circumstances would lead a father to such an extreme action? And how could such a secret be kept for so long? The unknown fourth option. Perhaps the truth was something no one had considered, some combination of circumstances that didn't fit neatly into any theory. Perhaps there were factors at play that never emerged, witnesses who never came forward, connections that were never made. In the end, the only certainty was uncertainty itself. The psychological toll of unresolved missing persons cases is well documented. Families exist in what researchers call ambiguous loss, grief without closure, mourning without an endpoint. There is no funeral, no grave to visit, no definitive end to hold on to. Just endless questions and the corrosive acid of not knowing. Shanika Ondaatje lived with this for 35 years. She existed in a state of perpetual maybe. Maybe Ames was dead. Maybe he was alive. Maybe he was suffering. Maybe he was happy. Maybe he remembered her. Maybe he had no idea he'd ever been anyone other than whoever he became. The psychological literature on ambiguous loss describes how it prevents normal grief processing. Without confirmation of death, the bereaved cannot fully accept the loss. Without confirmation of life, they cannot move forward with hope. They are frozen in between, unable to heal because the wound never closes. It just continues to bleed, quietly, endlessly. For the investigators who worked the case over the years, the lack of resolution was its own form of torment. Detectives are trained to find answers, to solve puzzles, to bring closure. The Ames Glover case offered none of that. It was a case that consumed resources, generated theories, sparked debates about racial disparity and media bias, but never yielded the one thing everyone sought: the truth. For Paul Glover, the past 3 decades had been marked by the heavy weight of suspicion. Though never charged, never convicted, he lived under a cloud that never lifted. In a society that presumes innocence, he was treated by many as guilty of something, even if no one could prove what. He gave occasional interviews over the years, each time maintaining his innocence, insisting he had told the truth, expressing his own anguish over Ames's disappearance. Whether these were the words of a grieving father or a skilled liar, no one could definitively say. "I have told the truth from the beginning," he said in a 2012 interview. "I don't know what happened to my son. I wish I did. I wish I could give Shanika answers. I wish I could have answers for myself. But I can't. I can only tell you what I know, and what I know is that I parked my car, locked it, went to get money and food, and came back to find Ames gone. That is the truth." In the absence of evidence to the contrary, his account stood. But in the court of public opinion, many remained unconvinced. In Southall, where the story began, Ames Glover became something of a local legend, the baby who vanished. Older residents remembered the investigation, the police presence, the appeals for information. Younger residents learned the story through whispered retellings, each version slightly different, details added or subtracted through the years. South Road, where it all happened, continued to bustle with life. The bank remained, though the cash point had been upgraded multiple times. Quality, the restaurant where Paul picked up curry that evening, eventually closed and was replaced by another establishment. The street moved on as streets do, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded there. But for those who knew, who remembered, there was always a shadow on that corner. A reminder that terrible things could happen in broad daylight on busy streets. A reminder that sometimes people simply disappeared, and no amount of investigation, technology, or time could bring them back or explain why. As of 2025, 35 years after his disappearance, Ames Glover remains missing. The case is officially open but has no active leads. If alive, Ames would be 35 years old. A man now, perhaps with a family of his own, perhaps with no idea that somewhere a mother still searches for him. The Metropolitan Police maintain the file. Every few years, when advances in forensic technology occur, someone reviews the case to see if new techniques might reveal something previously missed. DNA databases are checked against unidentified remains. Social media is monitored for any mention of unusual circumstances involving someone of Ames's age and background. Tips still come in occasionally, sparked by documentaries or anniversary coverage. Each time, investigators follow up. Each time, they find nothing. Shanika Ondaatje, now 57, continues to advocate for missing persons, particularly missing children of color whose cases don't receive adequate attention. She has worked with organizations pushing for reforms in how missing persons cases are investigated and covered by media. Her son's case has become a rallying point for discussions about racial equity in law enforcement. But beyond the activism, beyond the interviews and appeals, there is simply a mother who does not know what happened to her child. A mother who looks at photographs of a 5-month-old baby and tries to imagine the 35-year-old man he might have become. A mother who has lived more than half her life in the shadow of one terrible evening. The fundamental questions that plagued investigators from the beginning remain unanswered. Was Ames alive when Paul parked on South Road that evening? If so, how did someone take him from a locked car without witnesses? If Ames died or was harmed before that evening, where is his body? How could it remain hidden for 35 years despite extensive searches? If Ames was taken to Ghana or elsewhere, how was such a plan executed? Who was involved? Why has no one broken silence? Were there witnesses who saw something but chose not to come forward? If so, why? What happened in those 20 minutes on South Road, Southall, on February 5, 1990? The case file contains thousands of pages of reports, interviews, forensic analyses, and investigative summaries. It represents tens of thousands of man-hours of police work, multiple reopenings, international investigations, and the implementation of cutting-edge forensic techniques as they became available. And yet, for all that effort, the file cannot answer the most basic question. What happened to Ames Glover? The Ames Glover case stands as one of Britain's most baffling missing person investigations. It has all the elements of an unsolvable mystery. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no clear motive, no definitive suspect, and no body. It is a case where every theory requires believing something that seems unlikely, where every explanation raises as many questions as it answers. It is also a case that exposes uncomfortable truths about society, about how racial and socio-economic factors influence which missing persons receive attention, resources, and sustained public interest. Ames Glover's case might have faded from memory more quickly than others, but it has also become a symbol of disparity, a rallying cry for more equitable treatment of all missing persons regardless of their background. For true crime enthusiasts and professional investigators alike, the case is endlessly fascinating and endlessly frustrating. It is a puzzle with missing pieces, a story without an ending, a question without an answer. But beyond the intellectual exercise, beyond the theories and speculation, there is a human reality that should never be forgotten. A baby disappeared, and no one knows what happened to him. A mother has spent 35 years searching for answers that never come. A case that should have been solved in those critical first 48 hours instead became a decades-long mystery. Looking back at those first 48 hours, the golden window when most cases are solved, what could have been done differently? The initial response was swift. Police arrived within minutes of the call. The scene was secured. Witnesses were interviewed. Forensic evidence was collected. The investigation was aggressive and thorough. Resources were committed. Officers worked around the clock. No obvious avenue was left unexplored. And yet, the case went cold almost immediately because there was nothing to work with. No witnesses saw an abduction. No forensic evidence suggested foul play. No physical trail led anywhere. The investigation ran into a wall not because of incompetence or lack of effort, but because there was simply nothing there to find. Or perhaps there was something there, something everyone missed, some small detail that would have cracked the case wide open if only someone had noticed it. That's the torture of cold cases. The not knowing extends even to the investigation itself. Did they miss something crucial? Or was there never anything to find? Despite everything, despite 35 years, despite failed investigations, despite the statistical improbability of resolution, hope persists. Hope that someone who knows something will finally come forward. Hope that advancing technology will provide new tools for old evidence. Hope that Ames Glover, against all odds, is alive somewhere and might one day learn his true identity. It is this hope that keeps Shanika going. It is this hope that keeps the investigation officially open. It is this hope that ensures Ames Glover, 5 months old when he disappeared, will not be forgotten. But hope, as any parent of a missing child will tell you, can be as cruel as it is necessary. Keeps you alive, but it prevents you from healing. Keeps you searching, but it means you can never rest. It is both gift and curse, sustenance and torture. Somewhere, somehow, there is a truth to what happened to Ames Glover. Whether that truth died with someone who will never speak, whether it is buried in Ghana or hidden in plain sight in Britain, whether it will ever be discovered. These questions remain open. What is certain is that on February 5, 1990, at approximately 6:45 p.m., on a busy street in Southall, London, a 5-month-old baby named Ames Glover ceased to exist in the physical world and became instead a ghost. A question mark? A mystery? A permanent absence in the shape of a child. The investigation continues, technically, though no one seriously expects a breakthrough after 35 years. But the case remains open because closure without truth is impossible. Until Ames is found, until someone confesses, until evidence emerges that definitively explains what happened, the case of Ames Glover will remain one of Britain's most haunting unsolved mysteries. And a mother will continue to search for a son who disappeared in 20 minutes and was never seen again. The case of Ames Glover teaches uncomfortable lessons about society, about justice, about the limitations of law enforcement, and about how some truths may never be known. It teaches that racial disparity in missing persons cases is not an abstraction but a lived reality with devastating consequences. It teaches that the first 48 hours, while critical, are not always sufficient if there is nothing to find. It teaches that some cases resist every attempt at solution, no matter how much effort is applied. Most importantly, it teaches that behind every cold case is a human being whose absence leaves a permanent wound in the lives of those who love them. Statistics and theories and investigative techniques are important, but they should never obscure the fundamental human tragedy. A child is gone, and no one knows where. Ames Glover would be 35 years old now. Somewhere, perhaps, he is. Somewhere, perhaps, he lived and grew and became a man, never knowing he was the subject of multiple investigations, never knowing his mother never stopped searching. Or perhaps he died in February 1990, and the truth of his death is known only to whoever is responsible. A secret carried to graves or held in silence for reasons known only to those who keep it. The case remains open. The search continues. The questions endure. And on South Road in Southall, life goes on, indifferent to the mystery that began there 35 years ago, when a baby disappeared and the truth disappeared with him. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, Make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Vanishing of Alain Can. On April 14, 1990, French glam rock singer Alain Can descended into the Paris metro and stepped into oblivion. The afternoon air in Paris on Saturday, April 14, 1990, carried the gentle warmth of early spring. Along the elegant streets of the 16th arrondissement, chestnut trees budded with new life, their branches casting dappled shadows on the sidewalks below. It was the kind of day that promised renewal, hope, a cruel irony given what was about to unfold. Alain Can entered the Châtelet metro station that afternoon, accompanied by his partner, Hubert. The two men stood on the platform together, the rumble of approaching trains echoing through the tiled corridors. Hubert watched as Alain prepared to board, his partner's face drawn with the weight of recent arguments. They had been fighting about money, about drugs, about futures that seemed increasingly uncertain. Hubert didn't board the train. He simply deposited Alain at the station and didn't get on the metro himself. It was a decision that would haunt him for years to come, though at the time it seemed unremarkable. They had exchanged a few words, nothing memorable, nothing that suggested finality. Then Alain stepped into the car, and Hubert turned to leave. The metro doors slid shut with a pneumatic hiss. Alain Can needed to travel just 3 stations to reach his apartment near the Gare de Lyon. 3 stops. Perhaps 10 minutes of travel time. A journey he had made countless times before through the labyrinthine tunnels beneath Paris, where millions of anonymous faces passed each other daily in the fluorescent-lit corridors of the city's underground. He never arrived. The confusion began gradually, like a shadow lengthening across a sundial. When Alain didn't return home that evening, Hubert felt the first stirrings of concern. But concern was not yet alarm, not yet. Alain was unpredictable, mercurial, a creature of impulse who had built his entire career on defying expectations. Perhaps he had gone to meet a friend. Perhaps he needed space after their argument. Perhaps he was at a bar somewhere in the Marais, drowning his sorrows in cheap wine and cigarettes. Hours passed. The spring evening deepened into night. Paris transformed, as it always did after dark, into something both beautiful and menacing. A city of 1,000 faces, none of them quite trustworthy. By Sunday morning, April 15th, roughly 12 hours after Alain had vanished, Hubert's concern had calcified into genuine fear. He tried calling. No answer. He visited their usual haunts, the cafes and bars where the city's underground artists gathered. No one had seen him. He called mutual friends, his voice tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Nothing. Silence. An absence where Alain should have been. It wasn't until Monday, April 16th, 48 hours after the disappearance, that Hubert finally reached out to Alain's half-sister, Veronique. She learned of her brother's disappearance only 2 days after it occurred, when Hubert's call shattered what had been an ordinary Monday morning. "I can't reach Alain," Hubert said, his voice cracking. "No one can." Veronique's blood ran cold. She knew her brother, knew his struggles, his demons, the toxicodependence that had gnawed at him for years. But she also knew something else. The day before his disappearance, singer Daniel Dark had encountered Alain by chance, and Alain had mentioned arguing with both his partner and his mother. These were not good signs. These were the kinds of details that, in retrospect, would take on the weight of prophecy. The first critical hours, the golden window of opportunity in any missing person case, had already slipped away. No alarm had been raised. No search initiated. No witnesses questioned while memories were fresh. Alain Can had simply ceased to exist, and for 48 hours, no one with the power to mobilize a search had even known. In those crucial first 2 days, several witnesses would later report seeing Alain at the metro. Some said they saw him at the Rue de la Pampa station on Line 9 in the 16th arrondissement. Others insisted it was Châtelet, the massive central hub where multiple lines intersected. The conflicting accounts created an immediate problem for investigators. Which witnesses could be trusted? Had people seen Alan at different times, at different stations? Or were memories already becoming unreliable, contaminated by suggestion and media coverage? This confusion exemplified why the first 48 hours are so critical in missing person cases. Memory is a fragile thing, easily corrupted. Security camera footage gets recorded over. Witnesses move on with their lives. Physical evidence degrades or disappears. Every hour that passes without action exponentially decreases the chances of finding someone alive, or finding them at all. By Monday evening, Veronique had contacted the police. The officers who took her statement were professional but not particularly alarmed. 45-year-old men disappeared in Paris with distressing regularity, usually voluntarily. They asked the standard questions. Had Alan been depressed? Did he have financial problems? Relationship troubles? Drug issues? Yes to all of the above. The police made notes. They would investigate, they said. But Paris was a city of millions, and a missing adult who might simply have chosen to disappear was not their highest priority. Veronique left the police station feeling hollow, afraid. The weight of those lost 48 hours pressed on her chest like a physical force. If they had known sooner, if someone had called immediately, if. The word "if" would become the refrain of this entire tragedy. As the sun set on April 16th, marking the end of the critical 48-hour window, Alan had been missing for exactly 2 days. In missing person cases, this threshold represents a grim statistical reality. Studies show that if a missing person isn't found within the first 2 days, the chances of locating them alive drop precipitously. The trail goes cold. Leads evaporate. Hope begins its slow, agonizing death. Somewhere in Paris. Or perhaps no longer in Paris at all. Alan existed in a state of quantum uncertainty. Simultaneously alive and dead, present and absent, real and ghostly. The city that had shaped him, that had watched him transform from a clean-cut chanson singer in the 1960s into a glam rock provocateur in the 1970s, into a punk pioneer, into a struggling artist whose best days seemed behind him, that same city had now swallowed him whole. The metro tunnels beneath Paris wind for over 200 kilometers, a serpentine network of passages and stations, service corridors and abandoned platforms. Millions of people flow through this underground world every day, anonymous and hurried, barely registering each other's existence. It is the perfect place to vanish, the perfect place to become no one. As Tuesday, April 17th dawned, the beginning of hour 49 in Alan Can's disappearance, his family and friends began to face a terrible truth. The critical window had closed. Whatever had happened to Alan in those first precious hours was now buried beneath layers of time and uncertainty. The investigation was about to begin in earnest, but it would be starting from a position of profound disadvantage. The first 48 hours, those golden hours when witnesses remember clearly and evidence remains fresh, were gone forever. And so was Alan Can. Detective Laurent Mercier of the Paris Police Prefecture took over the case on April 18th, 4 days after the disappearance. A 20-year veteran with thinning gray hair and perpetually tired eyes, Mercier had handled dozens of missing person cases. Most ended within a week, sometimes happily, sometimes not. But something about the Alan Can case immediately struck him as different. The file on his desk was frustratingly thin. No body, no ransom demand. No confirmed sighting after the metro station. It was as if the man had dematerialized. Mercier began with the basics, reconstructing Alan's final days. Born Alan Michel Zissa in 1944, Can had been raised by his mother and stepfather, never knowing his biological father. The name Can came from his stepfather, but the man behind the name had always been searching for something. Identity, acceptance, fame, oblivion. Can's career had started with chanson pop singles in the 1960s, but he later reinvented himself as a glam rock provocateur after a transformative time in London during the 1970s. He had met David Bowie at Chateau de Herouville during a recording session, and that encounter had changed everything. Can said of this meeting, "In Herouville, I met Bowie, who took me away for 10 days in his black Mercedes." The glam years had been Can's peak. Albums like E.T. Gary Cooper Esseloigna dans le Desert, 1975, and Heureusement en France on NESE Drogue Pas, 1976, had established him as a cult figure, theatrical, provocative, openly gay at a time when that required immense courage. But the punk era had been less kind to him. His 1979 album, Whatever Happened to Alain Z. Can, had been banned from radio and pulled from stores because it included samples of Hitler's speeches in a song meant to satirize fascism. The controversy had destroyed what little commercial viability he still possessed. By 1990, Can's career seemed dead. His last album, Parfait de Nuit, had been released in 1986 to complete indifference. He was struggling financially, fighting with his partner Hubert, and battling a drug addiction that had only worsened with his declining fortunes. Several people had requested large sums of money from close contacts in the days before his disappearance, supposedly to finance a new album project. He had also asked his mother to care for his cats for a while. These details created a complex picture. Were they evidence of a planned departure, or the desperate actions of a man in crisis, grasping at any lifeline? Mercier interviewed Hubert multiple times. The young man was devastated, barely functional. His story never wavered. He had dropped Alain at the metro station, they had exchanged a few words about Alain going home, and that was the last time he saw him. Police quickly ruled Hubert out as a suspect. The detective next tracked down Daniel Dark, the singer who had seen Alain on April 13th. Dark was haunted by that chance encounter, replaying it endlessly in his mind. Alain had mentioned fighting with Hubert and his mother. He had seemed agitated, distracted, but not, Dark insisted, suicidal. Not explicitly. But then again, who could say what thoughts churned beneath Alain's carefully constructed exterior? Mercier also spoke with Patrick Eudline and Marie France, both of whom had seen Alain in early April. They reported that he seemed troubled, but not more so than usual. For Alain, trouble was a baseline state of being. The detective pursued every lead, no matter how thin. He checked every hospital in Paris and the surrounding departments. Nothing. He reviewed records from the morgue, studying photographs of unidentified bodies that had been pulled from the Seine or found in alleyways. None matched Alain's description. No credit card activity was recorded, but then, Alain no longer had a credit card by 1990. His financial situation had deteriorated to the point where he operated entirely in cash, and cash leaves no trail. The metro presented its own investigative nightmare. The Paris metro system was a vast, interconnected maze with limited security camera coverage in 1990. The stations that did have cameras preserved footage for only 48 to 72 hours before it was recorded over. By the time Mercier began his investigation, any potential visual evidence had been erased. He questioned metro workers, conductors, station attendants. A few remembered seeing someone matching Alain's description, tall, thin, with distinctive features and an unconventional style of dress. But no one could say definitively which direction he had traveled, which train he had boarded, or where he might have exited. One station attendant at Châtelet offered an intriguing detail. He vaguely remembered a man fitting Alain's description seeming disoriented on the platform, as if uncertain which train to take. But this memory came weeks after the disappearance, contaminated by media coverage and the power of suggestion. Could it be trusted? Mercier couldn't say. The detective considered various scenarios, each darker than the last. Suicide. Some speculated he might have thrown himself into the Seine. Paris's river had claimed many desperate souls over the centuries, and not all bodies were recovered. The currents could carry a corpse far downstream before it surfaced, if it surfaced at all. A psychic consulted by Veronique had suggested this possibility. But the banks of the Seine in central Paris were crowded with pedestrians and tourists, especially on a pleasant spring afternoon. Surely someone would have seen something? Murder. The possibility of a drug debt that had come due, a transaction gone wrong, a confrontation with a dealer turned violent. Can moved in dangerous circles, frequented places where violence simmered just beneath the surface. But again, no body. And murders in Paris rarely went entirely unnoticed. Someone usually saw something, said something. Voluntary disappearance. This theory gained traction as the investigation progressed. The money requests, the arrangements for his cats, the timing, all of it suggested planning. Perhaps Alain had simply decided to start over, to shed the skin of his failed Parisian life and become someone new somewhere else. Some claim to have seen him in Geneva between 1992 and 1994. Others said they spotted him in India, but Mercier was skeptical. Voluntary disappearance seemed inconsistent with Cannes' extroverted, even exhibitionistic personality. This was a man who had spent his entire life desperately seeking attention, recognition, fame. Would such a person really choose anonymity? Accident. The metro system was dangerous. People fell onto tracks, were crushed between cars, died in maintenance tunnels. But metro accidents were investigated, documented. Bodies were found. The lack of any physical evidence made this scenario unlikely. As April turned to May, then June, the case began to grow cold. Tips came in, dozens of them, but all led nowhere. Someone thought they saw Alain at a bar in Belleville. Another claimed he was living rough near the Canal Saint-Martin. A third insisted he had fled to Brazil. None of the sightings could be confirmed. Veronique, desperate for answers, did something that would later seem both heartbreaking and futile. The family made an appeal on the television program Perdu de Vue, hosted by Jacques Pradel. Christophe, Cannes' brother-in-law and a famous singer in his own right, participated. The episode aired to millions of viewers across France. The response was overwhelming and useless. Hundreds of people called in, each claiming to have information. But the calls revealed nothing concrete, only the cruel power of collective imagination to manufacture false memories and spurious connections. Mercier continued working the case through the summer and into the fall, but with diminishing resources and attention. The Paris police prefecture had more urgent matters: rising crime rates, drug trafficking, organized crime. A missing glam rock singer from the 1970s, no matter how tragic his disappearance, simply couldn't command indefinite resources. By December 1990, 8 months after Alain Can vanished, the case was effectively dormant. Not closed, technically it remained open, but no longer actively investigated. Detective Mercier had exhausted every lead, pursued every possibility. The file sat in a cabinet, gathering dust, waiting for a break that might never come. Alain Can had become what he perhaps always feared most: forgotten. But Veronique couldn't forget. She visited police stations, made calls, wrote letters. She hired a private investigator who quickly ran out of leads. She consulted psychics, mediums, anyone who claimed they could pierce the veil between the known and unknown. All of them offered theories. None provided answers. The investigation had revealed much about Alain Can's life. His struggles, his brilliance, his pain, but nothing about his fate. He existed now in a liminal space, neither fully present nor fully absent. Schrödinger's rock star, simultaneously alive and dead in the collective consciousness of everyone who knew him. The unanswered questions multiplied. Had those 48 lost hours made the difference? If the alarm had been raised immediately, if the investigation had begun that first night, would the outcome have been different? Was there a critical moment, a point of no return, that might have been prevented? Or was Alain Can's disappearance always inevitable, the logical conclusion to a life lived at the extremes, burning too brightly and too fast? Detective Mercier couldn't answer those questions. No one could. The years following Alain Can's disappearance settled over his family and friends like a fog that refused to lift. Time, that supposedly great healer, proved powerless against the particular anguish of not knowing. Grief, at least, has a shape, a beginning, middle, and possibility of acceptance. But Alain's absence was shapeless, infinite, a void that grew larger rather than smaller as the years passed. Veronique aged visibly under the weight of uncertainty. In 1971, she had married the singer Christophe, making Alain his brother-in-law, a connection that had brought both men joy and creative collaboration. Now she found herself caught between two losses: her brother's physical disappearance, and her husband's emotional withdrawal. Christophe refused to speak of Alain in the past tense, insisting stubbornly that he was on tour and would return someday. It was denial rendered as poetry, but denial nonetheless. The French music industry moved on quickly. By 1991, Alain Can was already becoming a footnote, a curiosity mentioned in retrospectives about the glam rock and punk eras but rarely examined in depth. His albums became increasingly rare, sought after by collectors not for their artistic merit, though that was considerable, but for their scarcity. Market forces transformed him into a commodity even as his humanity faded from collective memory. But among a certain subset of Paris's underground art scene, Alain became something else. A legend, a ghost story, a cautionary tale. Young musicians invoked his name with reverence mixed with unease. He represented both the glory and the danger of total artistic commitment, of refusing to compromise even when compromise might have meant survival. The theories about what happened multiplied and mutated over time, taking on lives of their own. Some insisted he had been murdered by drug dealers, his body disposed of so thoroughly that it would never be found. They pointed to his known associations with dangerous people, his mounting debts, his increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks before he vanished. In this version of events, Alain Can died violently in some anonymous location. An abandoned building, a dealer's apartment, the dark corner of a nightclub, and his killers ensured there would be nothing left to find. Others believed he had taken his own life in a moment of despair, perhaps jumping into the Seine as the psychic had suggested. Depression had stalked him throughout his adult life, exacerbated by drug use and professional disappointment. At 45, he faced middle age with nothing to show for his decades of work except faded memories and a handful of banned albums. Perhaps the metro station had simply been a detour on the way to the river, where he had chosen to end his story on his own terms. The voluntary disappearance theory persisted, fed by occasional rumors and unverifiable sightings. Someone claimed to have encountered him in India years later, a man who admitted to having been famous in France under the name Alain Kansas. Others reported seeing someone matching his description in Switzerland, in Brazil, in Morocco. These stories had the quality of urban legends, impossible to prove or disprove, tantalizingly specific in detail yet frustratingly vague in substance. Could Alain have reinvented himself, assumed a new identity, started over in a place where no one knew his history? The logistics of such a disappearance in 1990, before ubiquitous digital surveillance but still in an era of bureaucratic documentation, were not impossible. With enough planning and determination, a person could still vanish. But something about this theory always felt incomplete. Friends who knew Alain intimately struggled to imagine him living quietly, anonymously. He was a performer to his core, someone who needed an audience even when that audience had dwindled to a handful of loyal fans. Could such a person really spend years, decades, in self-imposed obscurity? There were darker theories too, whispered in confidence. Some suggested involvement with occult groups, rituals gone wrong, deliberate erasure by people with the power and motivation to make someone disappear completely. These theories belonged more to fiction than fact, but the absolute absence of evidence created space for even the most outlandish speculation. The psychological toll on those left behind was immense. Hubert, Alain's partner, struggled with guilt that bordered on self-destruction. He replayed their final interaction endlessly, searching for clues he might have missed, warning signs he should have heeded. If only he had insisted on riding the metro with Alain. If only he hadn't let their argument fester. If only, if only, if only. The phrase became a mantra of survivor's guilt. Friends from Alain's music circle dealt with the loss in various ways. Some threw themselves into their own work, as if productivity could ward off the existential dread his disappearance represented. Others spiraled into addiction, seeing in Alain's fate a dark mirror of their own possible futures. Still others simply drifted away, unable to bear the weight of collective grief and confusion. Daniel Dark, who had been one of the last people to see Alain alive, became haunted by that chance encounter. In interviews years later, he would mention Alain with a reverence that bordered on obsession. The disappearance had transformed Alan from a friend into an icon, from a person into a symbol of everything dangerous and alluring about the artist's life. As the 1990s progressed, French culture began to reconsider its underground music history. Critics and journalists, looking back at the glam and punk movements, rediscovered Alan Can's work. His albums were reissued by small independent labels. Articles appeared in music magazines, analyzing his lyrics, his production choices, his influence on artists who had followed in his wake. This posthumous appreciation, for he was increasingly treated as posthumous, despite the lack of a death certificate, revealed how ahead of his time Alan had been. His frank discussions of sexuality, his gender-fluid presentation, his political provocations that had once seemed merely shocking now appeared visionary. He had been asking questions about identity, power, and conformity that wouldn't become mainstream concerns until decades later. But the cultural rehabilitation couldn't solve the central mystery. What happened to him? In 2000, exactly 10 years after his disappearance, French authorities declared Alan Can legally dead, as the law required. The declaration was purely administrative, a legal fiction that allowed his estate to be settled and his family to find some bureaucratic closure. But declaring someone dead and knowing they are dead are two entirely different things. Veronique attended the proceeding that formalized her brother's legal death. She sat in a courtroom in Paris, listening to officials discuss Alan in the past tense, and felt nothing resolved. The paperwork might say he was dead, but in her heart, in her dreams, he remained suspended in that eternal moment of disappearance. Walking into the metro, turning back for one last look, then stepping through the doors into whatever came next. What came next? That was the question that would haunt everyone who knew him for the rest of their lives. The early 2000s brought new investigative techniques, DNA databases, improved forensic methods, digital record-keeping that might make voluntary disappearance more difficult. But none of these advances helped with Alan Can's case. There was no DNA to test, no new witnesses to interview, no fresh evidence to examine. The trail had gone cold before it was ever really warm. In 2013, journalist Carl Zero dedicated an episode of his program, Les Dossiers de Carl Zero, to Alan's disappearance, reigniting public interest in the case. The documentary interviewed friends, family members, fellow musicians. It explored theories, examined evidence, recreated that final day in meticulous detail. But it offered no answers. How could it? The answers, if they existed, had disappeared along with Alan Can that April day in 1990. The episode ended with a question posed directly to viewers. What do you think happened? The responses poured in, thousands of them, each presenting a theory, a possibility, a guess. The collective speculation revealed more about the speculators than about Alan. People saw in his disappearance whatever they needed to see. Tragedy, mystery, liberation, punishment, transcendence. He had become a mirror, reflecting back the fears and fantasies of everyone who contemplated his fate. By the 2010s, a new generation discovered Alan Can through the internet. His music found audiences that would have been impossible during his lifetime. YouTube videos of his performances accumulated views. Blog posts analyzed his lyrics. Forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries included his disappearance alongside cases that were genuinely sinister or suspicious. But for those who had known him personally, the internet attention felt hollow. They didn't want Alan Can the legend or the mystery. They wanted Alan Can the person. Difficult, brilliant, troubled, alive. Time's passage had done nothing to diminish the core questions. If anything, distance had made them more acute. Why did no one see anything suspicious at the metro? How did a distinctive-looking person in a major European capital simply evaporate? Where was the body, the evidence, the something that would transform uncertainty into knowledge? The absence of answers had become its own kind of presence, a negative space around which everyone's lives had to navigate. In the peculiar mathematics of disappearance, absence doesn't equal zero, it equals infinity. Every unanswered question spawns a dozen more. Every theory collapses under scrutiny, only to be replaced by 3 others. The mystery of what happened to Alan had metastasized over the decades into something larger and stranger than any single explanation could contain. By the 2020s, more than 30 years after Alan stepped into the metro, his case had achieved a kind of immortality. Not the immortality he sought in life, fame, recognition, the enduring power of his art, but a darker, more ambiguous immortality. He had become a question that refused to be answered, a wound that wouldn't heal. Veronique, now elderly, had never stopped searching. Not actively, perhaps. She no longer hired investigators or pursued leads with the urgency of those early years. But mentally, emotionally, every day she lived with the absence, parsing and reparsing the few facts she possessed, hoping that some new configuration of the known details might suddenly reveal the truth she sought. She had outlived Christophe, her husband and Alan's brother-in-law, who had passed away, still insisting that Alan was merely away, temporarily absent. His refusal to accept death without proof had been both touching and maddening. But perhaps, Veronique thought in her darker moments, he had been right. Without proof, how could anyone truly accept anything? The internet had transformed how people engaged with unsolved mysteries. Online communities dissected every aspect of Alan's life and disappearance with obsessive detail. Amateur investigators pored over photographs, analyzed lyrics for hidden clues, constructed elaborate timelines. Some even made pilgrimages to the metro stations where he was last seen, standing on the platforms as if proximity to the location might grant some insight denied to those who merely read about it. These digital archaeologists unearthed forgotten interviews, rare recordings, photographs that had been buried in private collections for decades. They created comprehensive archives of Alan's work, ensuring that his music would survive even if the man himself had not. In death or presumed death, Alan achieved a level of documentation and analysis that would have been impossible during his lifetime. But documentation is not resurrection. Analysis is not understanding. The theories that proliferated online reflected both human ingenuity and human desperation to find patterns in randomness. Some were plausible, grounded in the known facts. Others ventured into conspiracy, weaving elaborate narratives involving government cover-ups, witness tampering, mysterious organizations. A few approached the supernatural, suggesting that Alan had somehow transcended physical reality, an idea he might have found either flattering or hilarious, depending on his mood. Physical evidence, or the lack thereof, remained the central problem. In 3 decades, nothing had surfaced. No body in the Seine, though the river had been dredged multiple times for unrelated reasons. No remains in the metro tunnels, though maintenance workers traversed those dark corridors regularly. No documents in his handwriting, no confirmed photographs taken after April 14, 1990. Nothing. This absolute void of physical evidence forced everyone to rely on interpretation, speculation, and narrative construction. The facts were simple and few. Everything else was embellishment, an attempt to impose meaning on meaninglessness. Some investigators, both official and amateur, returned to the witness testimony from those first days. Multiple people claimed to have seen Alan at different stations, Rue de la Pampa, Châtelet. Rather than dismissing the conflicting accounts as errors, a new theory emerged. What if both groups of witnesses were correct? What if Alan had traveled to one station, then doubled back to another, creating a loop of movement that defied simple explanation? This theory opened up darker possibilities. If Alan had been moving between stations without a clear destination, it suggested either deep confusion or deliberate evasion. Was he running from something, or towards something? Had he been followed? Had he been trying to shake a tail? Or was this simply the paranoid reasoning of people desperate to find significance in coincidence? The physical spaces involved in the disappearance had changed over the decades. The Châtelet station had been renovated multiple times, its layout altered, its camera systems upgraded. The metro tunnels themselves had been expanded, rerouted, modernized. Whatever evidence might have existed in 1990 had been literally paved over, buried beneath layers of renovation and progress. This temporal distance created a strange effect. The case was simultaneously more visible and more obscure than ever. more visible because of internet documentation and ongoing media interest, more obscure because the physical reality of April 14th, 1990 had been erased, replaced by something newer, shinier, and utterly uninformative about what had happened that day. Cultural shifts had also changed how people understood Alain's story. His openness about his sexuality, his gender-fluid presentation, his refusal to conform, all of which had marginalized him during his lifetime, now seemed prescient and admirable. He had been living authentically in an era that punished authenticity, especially from queer artists who refused to hide or apologize. This recontextualization raised uncomfortable questions. Had Alain's disappearance been as mysterious as it seemed, or had it been the predictable outcome of a society that made certain lives precarious and certain deaths unremarkable? If a mainstream artist with powerful connections had vanished under identical circumstances, would the investigation have been more thorough, more persistent, more successful? These questions had no clear answers, but they haunted everyone who looked closely at the case. Theories about voluntary disappearance continued to circulate, fed by the occasional sighting that could never be verified. The claim that someone had met Alain in India years after his disappearance was repeated so often that it had achieved the status of urban legend, its details shifting slightly with each retelling. Some versions had Alain living as a spiritual seeker in an ashram. Others placed him in Goa, part of the hippie scene that persisted there through the 1990s. Still others suggested he had gone to India to die, seeking peace in the final stages of an illness he hadn't disclosed to anyone in France. All of these stories suffered from the same fundamental problem: no proof, no photographs, no documents, no first-hand testimony from credible sources. Just rumors, third-hand accounts, and the desperate desire to believe that somewhere, somehow, Alain can still existed. The possibility of suicide remained the most statistically likely explanation. Men in their mid-40s struggling with addiction and professional failure were at elevated risk. The Seine, with its dark waters and swift currents, had claimed many desperate souls over the centuries. The lack of a body didn't disprove this theory. Bodies sometimes never surfaced, carried downstream or trapped beneath debris. But suicide felt incomplete as an explanation. Friends who knew Alain well insisted that for all his struggles, he had never seemed genuinely suicidal. Depressed, yes. Frustrated, certainly. But possessed of that particular hopelessness that precedes self-destruction? They weren't convinced. Moreover, the timing seemed odd. Spring in Paris, pleasant weather, no immediate crisis beyond the ongoing struggles that had defined his life for years. Why then? Why that particular day? Unless, of course, something had happened that no one knew about. A phone call, a meeting, a confrontation. Some precipitating event that pushed him from chronic distress into acute crisis. But if such an event had occurred, it left no trace. No phone records, no witnesses, no evidence of any kind. The murder theory had its own logical problems. Paris in 1990 was not devoid of violence, especially in the world Alain inhabited. Drug dealers and users operated according to their own brutal logic. But murders, even in that world, tended to leave evidence. Bodies were found. Witnesses came forward. The complete absence of any physical evidence or credible testimony was unusual, unless the murder had been exceptionally well-planned and executed. Unless Alain had been killed by someone with the knowledge and resources to ensure complete disposal of evidence. But that level of sophistication seemed inconsistent with the chaotic, improvised world of street-level drug crime. As the case entered its fourth decade unsolved, a new generation of investigators, both official and amateur, began applying modern analytical techniques to the old evidence. Geographic profiling suggested possible routes Alain might have taken through the metro system. Statistical analysis identified patterns in the witness testimony, separating probable accurate memories from likely confabulations. Psychological profiling attempted to build a comprehensive picture of Alain's mental state in his final days. None of these techniques yielded a breakthrough. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. Too little evidence, too much time elapsed, too many possibilities. In 2024, a documentary filmmaker named Sophie Loren began work on an extensive film about Alan's life and disappearance. She interviewed dozens of people, musicians who had known him, family members, investigators, even people who claimed to have seen him after his disappearance. The resulting film was a meditation not just on one man's fate, but on the nature of mystery itself. How absence shapes memory, how uncertainty becomes unbearable, how the human mind struggles against accepting that some questions have no answers. The film ended without resolution because no resolution existed. It simply documented the ongoing wound, the persistent uncertainty, the terrible patience required to live with not knowing. Veronique watched the film in a small Parisian cinema, surrounded by strangers who had come to learn about her brother. She heard his voice again, saw his face move on the screen, experienced that particular ache that comes from encountering the dead, or presumed dead in recorded form. The past made present but not truly present. A ghost but not a haunting. After the screening, audience members approached her with questions, condolences, theories. She listened politely, but their words washed over her without penetrating. They were kind, these strangers. They cared in their way. But they couldn't understand what it meant to live for 34 years with a question that grew louder rather than quieter over time. Where is my brother? The question had no answer. Perhaps it never would. That night, walking home through Paris, Veronique passed near one of the metro stations where Alan had last been seen. The entrance glowed with its distinctive Art Nouveau design, beautiful even now. Thousands of people flowed in and out, heading to their destinations, living their lives, unaware that this ordinary space was for her a portal to an unsolvable mystery. She paused on the sidewalk, looking down into the illuminated tunnel. Somewhere beneath the city, in that labyrinth of passages and platforms, her brother had vanished. The metro had swallowed him, and whatever happened next, whether violence or despair or accident or choice, had occurred beyond the reach of witnesses, beyond the scope of evidence, beyond the possibility of knowing. In that moment, standing at the threshold between the known world above and the mysterious world below, Veronique understood something she had resisted for decades. She would die without knowing. The mystery of Alan's disappearance would outlive everyone who had loved him, becoming history rather than memory, an unsolved case rather than a personal tragedy. This realization didn't bring peace, how could it? But it brought a kind of clarity. She had done everything possible. She had searched, questioned, investigated, hoped. None of it had been enough. None of it had changed the fundamental fact that on April 14, 1990, her brother had descended into the Paris metro and never emerged. The truth, whatever it was, remained hidden in that moment, irretrievable, unknowable, lost to time. As Veronique walked away from the metro entrance, disappearing into the Parisian night like so many others before her, Alan's fate remained what it had always been. A question without an answer, a story without an ending, a disappearance that somehow seemed to expand rather than contract over the decades, growing larger and stranger until it ceased to be about one man and became instead a meditation on absence itself. How it persists, how it transforms, how it refuses to be forgotten even when forgetting would be easier. The metro continues to run. Millions of people travel through its tunnels each year, most of them unaware that they're passing through a space where someone once vanished completely. The tiles have been cleaned and replaced. The tracks have been maintained and upgraded. The trains are newer, faster, more efficient. But the mystery remains, eternal and unchanging. Alan is still missing. He will always be missing, and somewhere beneath Paris, or perhaps nowhere at all. The answer to what happened that day waits in silence, patient as stone, keeping its secrets in the darkness where no one can find them. The case remains open, technically, officially, though no one actively investigates anymore. There are no new leads to pursue, no witnesses to interview, no evidence to analyze. Just a file in an archive, gathering dust, waiting for a miracle that will never come. In the end, perhaps that's the truest statement that can be made about Alan's disappearance. It is a mystery that will endure precisely because it cannot be solved. And in that endurance, in that persistence of the unknown, There is something almost fitting for a man who spent his life resisting easy categorization, refusing simple answers, existing always at the margins of what society could understand or accept. He vanished into uncertainty, and uncertainty is where he remains, forever suspended in that eternal moment of descent, walking down into the metro station, turning back once to look at the world above, then stepping through the doors into whatever comes next. What came next? No one knows. No one will ever know. And that, finally, is the story of Alan Ken, a man who became a mystery that became a legend that will never be anything but an unanswered question echoing through the tunnels beneath Paris, growing fainter with each passing year but never quite falling silent, never quite fading away. The disappearance of Alan Ken reminds us why the first 48 hours matter so desperately in any missing person case. In those critical hours, when memories are fresh and evidence is present, when witnesses can still be found and trails can still be followed. In those hours, the difference between finding someone and losing them forever often comes down to minutes, to decisions, to luck. For Alan Ken, those 48 hours passed without alarm, without urgency, without anyone understanding that time was running out. By the time the investigation began, the window had closed. The opportunity had passed. The trail had gone cold, and a man had become a ghost, haunting the space between existence and absence, presence and memory, life and death, forever caught in transit, never arriving, never quite departing, suspended eternally in the darkness beneath the city he once called home. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Vanishing of Christopher Kurz. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. The morning air in Eagan, Minnesota carried the promise of spring, though frost still clung stubbornly to the edges of window panes. Inside the Kurz family home, 17-year-old Christopher Matthew Kurz pressed his palm against his forehead, the coolness offering brief relief from the throbbing pain radiating behind his eyes. "Mom, I don't think I can go to school today," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of teenage discomfort that Lonnie Kurz had heard countless times before. "My head is killing me." Lonnie studied her eldest son, brown-haired, brown-eyed, his face marked by the severe acne that tormented so many teenagers. Christopher stood 5 feet 11 inches but weighed only 135 pounds. His frame lean and awkward in that way that suggested he hadn't quite grown into himself yet. Behind his blue-tinted, wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes looked tired. She'd raised 3 boys, and Christopher had always been the reliable one. A National Merit Scholar semifinalist, invited to join the National Honor Society, a member of the swim team and band, where he played clarinet with methodical precision. He wasn't the type to feign illness for a day off. "Let me get you something," she said, retrieving over-the-counter pain medication from the cabinet. As she handed him the pills with a glass of water, she watched him swallow them with the mechanical efficiency that characterized so much of what he did. Christopher was thoughtful, bookish, introverted, a teenager who preferred the company of a small circle of close friends to large social gatherings. "Do you want me to stay home with you?" Lonnie offered, maternal instinct urging her toward caution even though nothing seemed particularly amiss. "No, I'll be fine," Christopher insisted, his voice already sounding slightly distant. "I just need to rest." Jim Kurz had already left early that morning for a business trip, which meant Christopher would be alone in the house. It wasn't unusual. He was 17, after all, practically an adult. Lonnie worked at a local elementary school, and she couldn't simply call in without good reason. Christopher had never given her reason to worry. He'd never been in serious trouble, never shown signs of rebellion or distress that would make her question leaving him alone. At approximately 7:45 a.m., Lonnie kissed her son goodbye and walked out the door, the cool morning air greeting her as she headed to work. Behind her, The door clicked shut with a finality she wouldn't understand until much later. The house fell silent except for the soft padding of the family dog's paws on the kitchen floor. Somewhere between 8 a.m. and noon, Christopher Matthew Kurz moved through his family's home with purpose. His headache, whether real or fabricated, no longer seemed to matter. He located his father's prized possession, a vintage 1954-56 Mossberg 20-gauge bolt-action shotgun, an OF. Mossberg and Sons model with a 3-shell clip. Significantly, he did not take any ammunition. Then Christopher did something that would later puzzle investigators and his parents alike. He drove to the bank and withdrew $200 from his savings account. For a 17-year-old in 1990, this represented substantial money, approximately $470 in today's currency. The transaction left an electronic trail, a breadcrumb that would lead nowhere but raise infinite questions. Why would someone planning to end their life need money? What purchases would matter in their final hours? Christopher returned home and sat at the kitchen table. The house around him held the accumulated memories of his childhood. Photos on walls, the faint smell of his mother's cooking lingering from the night before, the comfortable wear of a family home where 3 boys had grown up. He picked up a pen. The note he wrote was brief, almost casual in its phrasing. Mom, something important came up plus feeling somewhat better. Back by 6. Unless I get lost. Love, Chris. That word, lost, he underlined twice. Twice. The emphasis would later strike his parents as significant, though they disagreed on what it meant. To Lonnie, it was an inside reference to Christopher's poor sense of direction, his tendency to get turned around even in familiar territory. To others, it would seem darker, more symbolic. A teenager underlining the word, lost, before disappearing forever carries weight that's impossible to ignore. Christopher placed the note carefully on the kitchen table where his mother would see it immediately upon returning home. Then he let the family dog loose, whether intentionally or through carelessness, no one would ever know. He gathered a few belongings. His black bifold leather wallet containing his Minnesota driver's license, his blue-tinted wire-rimmed glasses or hard contact lenses. He was severely nearsighted with 2400 vision in both eyes, and he dressed himself carefully. What Christopher Kurz wore that day would become etched in missing persons bulletins across the country. A mid-calf-length acid-washed light blue denim trench coat that fell almost to his ankles, a size large black cotton sweatshirt, size 29M blue or black bugle boy jeans with distinctive pockets at the knees, a black leather belt, white crew socks, size 11 brown leather boat shoes, and a plastic Swatch watch with a black and white zebra-striped band. Distinctive, memorable, the kind of details that should have made him easy to spot. At some point before 3:30 p.m., Christopher Matthew Kurz walked out of his house, climbed into the family's light blue 1988 Dodge Caravan, and drove away. He was never seen again. When Lonnie Kurz returned home at approximately 3:30 p.m., she immediately knew something was wrong. The sensation hit her before she could even articulate why. That primal maternal instinct that screams danger even when the conscious mind hasn't yet caught up. The family dog was running loose in the yard, confused and anxious. The blue Dodge Caravan gone. The house too quiet, too empty. "Christopher?" she called out, her voice echoing through rooms that felt suddenly cavernous. "Chris." Nothing. She moved through the house with increasing speed, checking his bedroom, the bathroom, the basement. The silence pressed against her eardrums. Then she saw the note on the kitchen table, her son's handwriting instantly recognizable. Mom, something important came up plus feeling somewhat better. Back by 6. Unless I get lost. Love, Chris. Lonnie read it once, twice, 3 times. Something important? What could possibly be so important that Christopher would take the van without asking? Let the dog loose, leave school. And that word, lost, underlined twice. Her hands began to tremble as she reached for the phone. Jim Kurz was somewhere on the road when his wife's panicked call came through. The conversation was brief, sharp with worry. He immediately turned around, abandoning his business trip to race back home. The 2-hour drive felt interminable. By 6 p.m., the time Christopher had promised to return, Both parents sat in their living room, staring at the phone, willing it to ring. The clock ticked forward. 6:30, 7, 8. Every passing minute stretched longer than the last. At approximately noon on April 21st, 1990, less than 24 hours after Christopher's disappearance, a letter arrived at the Kerrs' home. The postmark read Duluth, Minnesota, a city approximately 150 miles north of Eagan, roughly a 2.5-hour drive under normal conditions. Jim Kerrs' hands shook as he tore open the envelope. Inside, handwritten on what appeared to be ordinary paper, was a message that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The handwriting was Christopher's. Both parents recognized it immediately, though they would scrutinize every loop and line in the desperate hope they might be wrong. The letter confessed that Christopher had lied about his headache to gain access to the family van. He wrote that he intended to go to not even I know where. Most devastating of all, the letter clearly indicated his intention to take his own life. He apologized for the pain this would cause his loved ones. It was, as Jim would later describe it, a very loving letter, and I love you and goodbye. It didn't have any answers. 0. The letter offered no explanation for why. No hint of what had driven a 17-year-old National Honor Society student with a loving family to write a farewell note. No indication of what inner torment had been invisible to everyone who knew him. Just an apology for the hurt he was about to cause. Reading it felt like drowning. At midnight on April 21st, 1990, exactly 24 hours after the Kerrs' had first attempted to report their son missing, Eagan police finally accepted their missing person report. The delay wasn't callousness. It was standard procedure in 1990. The 24-hour rule reflected a time when missing teenagers were almost always runaways who returned home within a day or two, embarrassed and hungry but safe. But these first 24 hours, these critical, irreplaceable hours, were already gone. Christopher had an entire day's head start. If he'd driven straight to Duluth to mail the letter, he could have been anywhere by now. If someone had picked him up hitchhiking, he could be crossing state lines. If he'd walked into the vast forests of northern Minnesota, he could be miles deep into wilderness where search dogs would lose his scent and helicopters would see nothing but endless green canopy. The first 24 hours in any missing person case are universally acknowledged as the most crucial window for recovery. Witnesses' memories are fresh. Security footage hasn't been overwritten. The missing person hasn't traveled far. Evidence remains uncontaminated. Search patterns can be established while trails are still warm. But Christopher Kerrs' parents had spent those first 24 hours calling friends, checking with neighbors, pacing their living room, and begging police to take them seriously while their son vanished deeper into whatever fate awaited him. The Eagan Police Department immediately began their investigation, but they were already racing against time that had already run out. Detective work that should have begun on April 20th was now beginning on April 21st. Every hour that passed reduced the likelihood of finding Christopher alive. Jim and Lonnie answered questions with increasing desperation. No, Christopher had never shown signs of depression. No, there were no family fights or conflicts. No drugs, no alcohol, no girlfriend troubles, no bullying at school. He was an exceptional student looking forward to college. He had friends. He played clarinet in the band. He was on the swim team. Their family took camping trips to the Boundary Waters together. They just returned from a vacation to Washington State. Everything had seemed normal. How could everything be normal when their son had just written a suicide note? We desperately want to know why, Jim would later tell reporters. Why did this happen? As April 21st turned into April 22nd, the Kerrs family's nightmare was only beginning. The second day of Christopher Kerrs' disappearance began with a discovery that should have provided answers but instead multiplied the questions tenfold. At approximately 10 a.m., a local resident traveling along Minnesota Highway 38 in Itasca County noticed a light blue vehicle parked at an awkward angle on the shoulder of the rural road. Something about it seemed off. Not wrecked, not obviously broken down, just abandoned with a peculiar definitiveness. The concerned citizen called authorities. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, approximately 20 miles north of Grand Rapids, Minnesota, they found the Kurz family's 1988 Dodge Caravan. The location was significant for multiple reasons. First, it placed Christopher near the George Washington State Forest and the Chippewa National Forest, thousands upon thousands of acres of dense Minnesota wilderness where a person could vanish without a trace. Second, the area was close to where Lonnie's parents had once lived, suggesting Christopher might have had some familiarity with the region, though he'd certainly never driven there alone before. The van sat empty, keys still in the ignition. Inside, investigators found a note. Not a suicide letter this time, but a simple, almost courteous explanation of who owned the vehicle. Christopher had taken the time to write down his parents' contact information, as if concerned about the van being towed or stolen in his absence. The gesture was oddly considerate for someone allegedly planning to take their own life. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no indication that anything violent had occurred. The van simply sat there, silent and still, offering no clues about where its driver had gone or why he'd chosen this particular spot to abandon it. When word reached the Kurz family that the van had been found, hope and dread warred in their chests. The vehicle's recovery meant Christopher had indeed traveled north, confirming at least part of the letter's narrative. But where was he now? The discovery of the van without Christopher transformed the case from a missing teenager who might come home to a search for a body in the wilderness. Within hours of the van's discovery, law enforcement mobilized what would become one of the most intensive searches in the region's recent history. The Itasca County Sheriff's Office took the lead, coordinating with the Minnesota State Patrol, Eagan Police Department, and multiple volunteer search and rescue organizations. The search area was staggeringly vast. The George Washington State Forest alone encompasses over 500 square miles of dense woodland, bogs, streams, and rugged terrain. The Chippewa National Forest adds hundreds of thousands more acres. If Christopher had walked into this wilderness carrying his father's shotgun, he could be anywhere within a radius that grew exponentially with each passing hour. K-9 units arrived first, their handlers releasing tracking dogs at the point where the van had been abandoned. The dogs, German shepherds and bloodhounds trained to follow human scent even through difficult terrain, began their methodical work. For searchers and Christopher's family watching from a distance, these animals represented the best hope of finding him quickly. Dogs could cover ground far faster than human search parties, their noses capable of detecting scent traces invisible to any technology. The canines picked up something almost immediately. Handlers watched as the dogs began pulling with purpose away from Highway 38, their bodies tense with the focused intensity that meant they'd caught a scent trail. The dogs led searchers directly into the woods, moving with confidence through underbrush and over fallen logs. Behind them, search teams marked their path, calling out Christopher's name, ears straining for any response from the dense forest. 1 mile in, the dog's behavior changed. Experienced handlers recognized the moment when a tracking dog loses the scent. The animal's purposeful movement becomes confused, circular. They backtrack, trying to find where the trail continues, their frustration evident in whines and repeated casting back and forth. On that April day in 1990, approximately 1 mile into the George Washington State Forest from Highway 38, Christopher Kerr's scent trail simply ended. Not faded, ended, as if he'd vanished into thin air. The dogs did pick up a scent approximately 1 mile into the woods from Highway 38, but that ended abruptly, Eagan police would later confirm. Nothing was found. For search teams, this presented a baffling scenario. Scent trails don't just stop unless something significant interrupts them. The most common explanations include, the person got into a vehicle, but there was no road 1 mile into the forest. The person crossed water, but ground searches found no nearby stream at that exact location. The person was carried, but by whom and why? Or environmental conditions disrupted the scent, though weather had been relatively stable. None of the logical explanations fit. As ground teams continued their methodical grid search of the forest, the Minnesota State Patrol deployed helicopters to survey the area from above. The distinctive blue and white aircraft circled in expanding patterns, pilots and observers scanning the canopy below for any sign of the missing teenager. From the air, the search area revealed its true scale and difficulty. What looked on maps like open forest was, in reality, a complex tapestry of dense stands of pine and birch, wetlands choked with vegetation, clearings that might hide evidence, and the twisted shadows of fallen trees that could resemble a person from above. In 1990, aerial search technology was limited. No thermal imaging, no drones with high-resolution cameras, just human eyes and binoculars against thousands of acres of wilderness. The helicopters found nothing. Not Christopher's distinctive acid-washed blue trench coat. Not his body. Not even the shotgun he'd allegedly carried with him. The forest had swallowed him whole, leaving behind only that inexplicable 1-mile scent trail and a van with keys in the ignition. As search efforts intensified, a tip came into the investigation that would add another layer of mystery to the case. A driver contacted authorities claiming he'd picked up a hitchhiker along Highway 38 around the time Christopher disappeared. The hitchhiker, according to this witness, resembled Christopher's description and had requested a ride to Duluth, the same city where Christopher's letter had been postmarked. Investigators immediately recognized the significance. If this tip was accurate, it meant Christopher hadn't walked into the forest to die. It meant he'd hitchhiked north to Duluth, mailed his letter, and then... what? Continued running? Created a new identity? The hitchhiker theory opened possibilities that the suicide narrative didn't explain. But the tip couldn't be verified. The witness couldn't provide definitive identification. He wasn't certain of the exact date or time. The physical description was close but not perfect. Many 17-year-old boys in Minnesota had brown hair and glasses. Without concrete proof, the hitchhiker report became just another thread in an increasingly tangled investigation. If Christopher had indeed hitchhiked to Duluth after abandoning the van, it raised troubling questions. Why mail a suicide letter if you plan to keep moving? Why provide a return address on the van note if you wanted to disappear completely? Why withdraw $200 if you weren't going to need money? By noon on April 22, 1990, exactly 48 hours after Christopher's mother had last seen him, the critical investigative window was slamming shut. The first 48 hours represent the golden period in missing person cases, when chances of recovery are highest and evidence is freshest. After 48 hours, trails cool, memories fade, and the likelihood of finding the missing person alive drops dramatically. Eagan police had worked frantically within the constraints they'd been given. They'd searched Christopher's room thoroughly, finding his clarinet, his books, the ordinary detritus of a teenager's life, but no diary, no manifesto, no explanation. They'd interviewed his friends, who reported nothing unusual in Christopher's behavior or mood in the days before his disappearance. They'd contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to add Christopher to their database. They'd issued alerts to law enforcement agencies throughout Minnesota and neighboring states. But they were working backward, trying to reconstruct a timeline when crucial hours had been lost to the 24-hour waiting period. Where had Christopher been between leaving home around noon on April 20th and abandoning the van on Highway 38 sometime before its discovery? That's potentially 22 hours unaccounted for. Had he driven straight north, or had he stopped somewhere? Had he spent the night in the van, contemplating his decision? Had he encountered anyone who might remember seeing him? The bank withdrawal transaction was time-stamped, but after that, Christopher's movements were pure speculation. The letter postmarked from Duluth suggested he'd made it that far north. But when? Before or after abandoning the van near Grand Rapids? Grand Rapids and Duluth are in the same general region of northern Minnesota but approximately 80 miles apart. The geography didn't quite make sense unless Christopher had somehow traveled between multiple locations. By the end of the second day, search teams had combed miles of forest without finding a single piece of evidence beyond that 1-mile scent trail. No clothing, no footprints in soft earth, no broken branches marking his passage, no shotgun, no body. Christopher Kurz had managed to vanish more completely than seemed possible. In an era before cell phones, before social media, before the digital footprints that make it nearly impossible to truly disappear, he'd somehow stepped out of the world, leaving barely a trace. As April 22nd turned into April 23rd, The Kerrs family faced a new reality. Their son wasn't coming home. The question was no longer when, but what happened? And as days would turn into weeks, then months, then years, that question would never receive an answer. The first 48 hours had passed. Christopher Matthew Kerrs was gone. 7 days after Christopher Kerrs disappeared, the phone rang in the Kerrs family home. It was late evening, and both Jim and Lonnie had been existing in that strange liminal space where sleep feels impossible and every sound carries the weight of potential news. Lonnie reached for the receiver, her heart hammering with desperate hope. "Hello?" she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Christopher." There was sound on the other end. Not silence, sound. Background noise that echoed with the unmistakable quality of music and multiple voices overlapping. Party. Someone somewhere was at a gathering while Lonnie Kerr's world was falling apart. "Hello?" She tried again, more urgently. "Who is this?" "Christopher, is that you?" The line went dead. Jim and Lonnie stared at each other across the kitchen table, the dial tone humming its hollow note between them. Wrong number? Prank call? But something about it felt wrong. The timing felt wrong. The quality of the listening silence before the hang-up felt wrong. The phone rang again 2 days later. Same pattern. Background noise suggesting a party or gathering, the sense of someone listening on the other end, and then a click as the call disconnected the moment either Jim or Lonnie tried to engage with the caller. Then it happened to Christopher's best friend, a neighbor kid who'd known him for years. Same mysterious calls, same party sounds, same abrupt disconnections. "It has to be Christopher," Lonnie insisted to police. "Who else would know both numbers? Who else would call us both?" The Eagan Police Department took the reports seriously. They arranged for call tracing technology, primitive by today's standards but cutting edge in 1990, to be installed on both phone lines. The next time the mystery caller rang, they'd theoretically be able to trace the origin. But the calls never came when the trace was active. Somehow, impossibly, the timing was always wrong. The calls continued for 6 agonizing months, a sporadic pattern of potential contact that kept hope flickering like a candle in a drafty room. Each ring of the phone sent adrenaline surging through the Kerrs household. Each hang-up brought crushing disappointment. The psychological torture of those calls was exquisite. Were they really from Christopher, silently reaching out but unable or unwilling to speak? Or were they from someone cruel enough to torment a grieving family? The not knowing gnawed at them. Then, as mysteriously as they'd begun, the calls stopped. 6 months after Christopher's disappearance, the phone fell silent. No more party sounds, no more hang-ups, just the ordinary telemarketers and wrong numbers of everyday life. The Kerrs kept their phone number the same, a decision they maintained for over 3 decades, hoping that someday, Christopher might remember it and call. While the mysterious phone calls haunted the Kerrs family, the physical search for Christopher continued with dogged determination despite diminishing returns. Additional search parties combed through the George Washington State Forest, expanding their grid patterns farther from the point where the van had been abandoned. Volunteers joined law enforcement, forming long lines of people who walked shoulder to shoulder through the wilderness, eyes scanning the ground for anything that might have belonged to Christopher. His distinctive acid-washed blue trench coat should have been visible from a distance. The zebra-striped Swatch watch, the brown leather boat shoes. Any piece of his carefully documented outfit would have been a breakthrough. They found nothing. The shotgun became a particular focus of the investigation. Jim Kerr's 1954-56 Mossberg 20-gauge bolt action was distinctive enough that anyone finding it would likely remember. Police issued public appeals asking hunters, hikers, and outdoor enthusiasts to report any firearms discovered in the woods. Minnesota's hunting community was large and active. Surely if the gun had been abandoned, someone would eventually stumble across it. Weeks passed with no reported sightings of the weapon. The financial trail died with the $200 withdrawal. Christopher's bank account showed no further activity. No ATM withdrawals, no checks cashed, no deposits. Whatever he'd planned to use that money for, it hadn't required additional funds from his account. This fact alone seemed to argue against a runaway scenario. How would a teenager survive for weeks or months with only $200 and no subsequent income? Credit card databases and social security number monitoring, rudimentary in 1990 compared to today's systems, showed no hits. Christopher wasn't applying for jobs, renting apartments, or accessing any of the services that require identification. He'd either created a completely off-the-grid existence or he was no longer alive to create any existence at all. As local news coverage began to wane, Jim and Lonnie Kurz made a decision that would define their decades-long search. They would keep Christopher's face in the public eye by any means necessary. Missing person posters went up throughout Minnesota and neighboring states. Christopher's school photo, showing his brown hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the unfortunate acne that marked him as distinctly teenage, appeared on bulletin boards in grocery stores, gas stations, post offices, and anywhere else the family could gain permission to display them. The posters included the critical details. Christopher Kurz, 17 years old, missing since April 20th, 1990. Last seen wearing a distinctive acid-washed blue trench coat. Maybe carrying a Mossberg 20-gauge shotgun. Contact Eagan Police Department with any information. Local television stations ran segments featuring interviews with Jim and Lonnie. The footage from those early interviews is heartbreaking in its raw desperation. Lonnie's voice cracks as she makes direct appeals. "Christopher, if you're watching this, please come home. Please just let us know you're okay. We love you. Whatever is wrong, we can work through it together." Jim's approach was different but equally painful to watch. He was a guy who, when he decided to do something, he would do it. What you need to know is he's always been a very great kid. He was a smart kid, a good sense of humor, the past tense, the barely contained anguish beneath the composed exterior. But media attention is fleeting, especially for cases classified as potential runaways rather than abductions. By the end of April, Christopher's story had largely disappeared from news broadcasts, replaced by fresher tragedies and more urgent headlines. Within the first month, 3 competing theories emerged among investigators, each with supporting evidence and glaring holes. This was the official leading theory, supported by Christopher's apparent suicide letter, the missing shotgun, and his choice to drive to a remote wilderness area. The note's content seemed clear in its intentions. The fact that he'd taken a firearm supported the conclusion. The lack of any subsequent sightings or financial activity suggested he'd never left the forest. But problems with this theory abounded. Why withdraw $200 if planning imminent suicide? Why take the time to write a note on the van explaining ownership? Why underline "lost" twice in the original note? Was it really just an inside joke about his directional challenges? Or something more significant? And most troubling, where was the body? Hundreds of searchers had covered miles of terrain. Even in dense forest, bodies are eventually found by animals, by decay processes, by sheer statistical probability. Yet Christopher had left no trace beyond that 1-mile scent trail. Some investigators floated the possibility that the suicide letter was intentional misdirection. Perhaps Christopher had meticulously planned his disappearance, using the letter to ensure no one came looking for him. The $200 withdrawal supported this theory. It was exactly the kind of money a teenager might withdraw to fund the first stages of a new life. The mysterious phone calls seemed to support this theory. If Christopher was alive and calling home, it suggested he'd successfully created a new existence, but couldn't quite sever all ties. The fact that his best friend also received calls indicated Christopher was thinking about his old life. But the flaws in this theory were equally significant. How would a 17-year-old with severe nearsightedness, no fake ID, and limited life experience successfully disappear in 1990? Where would he work without a social security number? How would he access medical care for his vision problems? And why, if he'd planned to run away, would he write a detailed suicide note that would traumatize his family? The cruelty seemed inconsistent with everything known about Christopher's character. Though less discussed publicly to avoid giving the family false hope, some investigators privately considered the possibility of abduction or murder. The scent trail ending abruptly could suggest Christopher was picked up by someone. Perhaps not a friendly hitchhiker situation, but something more sinister. The 1980s and early 1990s saw numerous high-profile cases of teenagers being abducted by predators. However, there was no evidence of struggle at the van site. No witnesses reported seeing Christopher with anyone else. The suicide note seemed genuine. Why would an abductor force their victim to write such a letter? And statistical probability argued against it. Stranger abductions are remarkably rare compared to runaways and family-related disappearances. As April turned into May, and May into summer, none of these theories could be proven or disproven. Christopher Kurz existed in a quantum state of uncertainty. Possibly dead, possibly alive, possibly somewhere in between in the minds of those who'd known him. The first 30 days established a pattern that would define the case for decades. Tantalizing clues that led nowhere, theories that couldn't be verified, and a family trapped in the unbearable limbo of not knowing. As summer 1990 faded into autumn, and autumn into the harsh Minnesota winter, the active search for Christopher Kurz necessarily contracted. Fresh cases demanded police resources. The media moved on. Volunteer search parties disbanded as snow made forest searches impossible. But for Jim and Lonnie Kurz, every day was the same desperate vigil. They maintained their house in Eagan exactly as it had been when Christopher disappeared, his room a shrine to his interrupted adolescence. His clarinet sat in its case. His books remained on shelves. The swimming team photo from junior year still hung on the wall. The preservation wasn't morbid so much as hopeful. When Christopher came home, everything would be waiting for him. The couple's younger sons, Tim and Patrick, grew up in the shadow of their missing brother. Family photos showed the visible gap, the empty space at the dinner table, the unspoken understanding that they were living in a home defined by absence. The psychological toll on a family when a child vanishes without explanation is immeasurable. There's no funeral, no closure, no way to process grief when the object of that grief might walk through the door at any moment. Jim Kurz threw himself into keeping Christopher's case alive. He contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children repeatedly, ensuring Christopher's information stayed current in their databases. He built relationships with cold case investigators, making himself the kind of persistent but respectful family member that cops appreciate rather than avoid. I've been notified every time there's an unidentified body or missing person found fitting his son's description anywhere in the country, Jim would later recount. The Eagan Police Department's diligence gave him something to hold on to, proof that Christopher hadn't been forgotten by the system. Lonnie coped differently, clinging to faith and hope as lifelines against despair. "The underlying thing for me is faith and hope," she explained to reporters. When asked directly if she believed Christopher was alive, her answer never wavered. "Yes, I do believe he's alive." The mysterious phone calls had stopped after 6 months, but their memory lingered. Both parents remained convinced that Christopher had been on the other end of those lines, silent but listening, trying to reach out but unable or unwilling to complete the connection. In 1993, 3 years after Christopher's disappearance, something unexpected happened that would thrust his case back into national consciousness. Minneapolis-based rock band Soul Asylum released their album Grave Dancers Union, featuring the single Runaway Train. The accompanying music video made an unprecedented decision. Instead of featuring the band or elaborate storytelling, it would showcase photographs and information about real missing children. Christopher Kurz was one of 36 missing children featured in various versions of the video. Runaway Train became a massive hit, reaching number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100 and receiving heavy rotation on MTV. This meant that millions of viewers, across America and eventually in international markets as localized versions featured missing children from other countries, saw Christopher's face and information. His school photo appeared on screen while Dave Pirner's gravelly voice sang lyrics that felt almost written for cases like Christopher's. "Can you help me remember how to smile? Make it somehow all seem worthwhile." I saw this opportunity to reach beyond the boundaries of doing a promotional thing for my record, Soul Asylum's lead singer later explained. The video's impact was immediate and profound. MTV viewers called in tips about missing children they thought they'd seen. Several of the featured children were eventually found, though usually as runaways living under assumed identities rather than abduction victims. For the Kerr's family, the video represented both hope and heartbreak. The exposure was invaluable, Christopher's face broadcast into living rooms across the nation. But the tips that came in, investigated dutifully by police, led nowhere. Every call that didn't result in finding Christopher felt like another small death. 16 years after Christopher's disappearance, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released an age progression photograph showing what Christopher might look like at age 33. The technology, increasingly sophisticated by the mid-2000s, used algorithms and artistic interpretation to age his teenage features into those of a man in his 30s. The progression photo showed a man with receding brown hair, the acne of youth replaced by adult features, but those same brown eyes behind glasses. The image was distributed to law enforcement agencies and posted on missing persons websites. The psychological complexity of these age progression photos for families is difficult to articulate. On one hand, they represent hope, acknowledgement that the missing person might have aged, might be living somewhere under another identity, might someday be recognized. On the other hand, they're a stark reminder of time stolen, of a child who grew into adulthood, if he grew at all, without his family. Jim studied the progression photo intently, trying to see his son in this middle-aged stranger's face. Would he recognize Christopher if they passed on the street? Would Christopher recognize himself? As social media platforms proliferated and the internet became an increasingly powerful tool for cold case investigation, the Kerr's family adapted their search strategies. Christopher's case appeared on websites dedicated to missing persons. Amateur sleuths on forums like Web Sleuths dissected every known detail, proposing theories ranging from plausible to fantastical. Some online investigators fixated on the mysterious phone calls, suggesting Christopher had been held captive and the calls were attempts to reach out for help. Others believed the suicide letter was coerced, that someone had forced Christopher to write it before killing him. Still others maintained he'd successfully disappeared and was living under an assumed identity, perhaps in Canada or Mexico. The Eagan Police Department continued its diligence despite the case's age. Every time a body was discovered in Minnesota or surrounding states, hikers finding remains in wilderness areas, construction workers unearthing bones, hunters stumbling across human skeletons, the department compared the details against Christopher's file. Height, age, dental records if available, any physical markers that might provide a match. None ever did. The shotgun Jim Kerr's had last seen in his gun cabinet remained missing. In more than 3 decades, no one reported finding a Mossberg 20 gauge matching that description in the George Washington State Forest or anywhere else. The weapon had vanished as completely as the boy who'd taken it. The enduring questions. As Christopher's case entered its second, then third decade, certain questions crystallized into the core mysteries that defied explanation. The scent trail. Why would trained tracking dogs follow Christopher's scent exactly 1 mile into the forest and then lose it completely? The abrupt ending suggested something significant happened at that point. But what? Searchers found no vehicle tracks in that location. No stream that might have carried his scent away. No explanation that satisfied the laws of physics and canine biology. The money, the $200 withdrawal, remained one of the most puzzling elements. If Christopher planned immediate suicide, why take money at all? If he planned to run away, why only $200? The amount was significant enough to suggest planning but insufficient for long-term survival. What had he intended to purchase or pay for? The letter. Forensic linguists who later reviewed Christopher's suicide note, with the family's permission, found nothing suggesting coercion. The handwriting was his. The tone and vocabulary matched his other writings. Yet something about it nagged investigators, particularly the placement of the note at home versus the letter mailed from Duluth. Why 2 communications? Why mail one but leave one on the kitchen table? The phone calls. 6 months of mysterious calls to the family and Christopher's best friend. Then silence. If the calls were from Christopher, why never speak? If they were pranks, who would be cruel enough to sustain the harassment for half a year? The timing, stopping exactly 6 months after the disappearance, suggested either significance or coincidence. But which? The geography. The hitchhiker report, never verified, claiming to have given a ride to someone matching Christopher's description toward Duluth. The van found near Grand Rapids. The letter postmarked from Duluth. The distances and timing don't quite align in a way that makes sense. How did Christopher get to Duluth to mail the letter if the van was abandoned near Grand Rapids? Had he hitchhiked multiple times? Had he walked? The logistics remain murky. Christopher Kurz would have turned 52 years old in 2025. His younger brothers, Tim and Patrick, are now middle-aged men themselves, living with the unresolved trauma of their brother's disappearance. His parents, Jim and Lonnie, have spent more than 3 decades in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn fully while hope flickers. The Kurz family made a decision early on that they've maintained throughout the decades. They kept the same phone number. The number Christopher would have memorized as a child, the number he would have known by heart if he ever wanted to call home. Even as technology changed landlines to cell phones, flip phones to smartphones, they kept that same number active, just in case. The Eagan Police Department still maintains Christopher's case file, though it's long since gone cold. His information remains in national databases. His DNA profile, extracted from childhood items like his toothbrush and hairbrush, is on file for comparison against unidentified remains. The age progression photos have been updated periodically as imaging technology improves, but no new leads have emerged in years. The forest that may have been his final resting place has been searched and researched. The lakes and waterways of northern Minnesota have been dragged and explored. Modern technology, ground-penetrating radar, improved satellite imagery, more sophisticated tracking methods, has yielded nothing that wasn't available to 1990s investigators. Contemporary cold case investigators and online communities continue to debate what happened to Christopher Kurz. The prevailing theories have evolved but remain fundamentally unprovable. Some believe Christopher died by suicide in the forest, and his remains have simply never been discovered. Minnesota's wilderness is vast enough to swallow evidence completely. Animals could have scattered remains. Deep ravines or bodies of water could have concealed his final location. The scent trail ending might have been nothing more than a quirk of wind patterns and terrain affecting the dog's abilities. Others maintain he's alive somewhere, having constructed a new identity with meticulous planning that belied his 17 years. The $200 provided initial funds. The suicide letter was misdirection. The phone calls were his way of maintaining psychological connection while protecting his anonymity. Perhaps he's living an ordinary life in another state or country, possibly with a new name, possibly even a family of his own, haunted by the deception but unable or unwilling to return. A smaller faction considers foul play, suggesting Christopher encountered someone dangerous after abandoning the van. Perhaps the hitchhiker who claimed to have given him a ride was actually involved in something more sinister. Perhaps the suicide letter was written under duress. Perhaps the mysterious phone calls were from someone who knew what happened to Christopher, taunting the family. Living with unresolved loss creates a specific kind of trauma that psychologists call ambiguous loss. Grief without closure, mourning without confirmation. Jim and Lonnie Kurz have lived in this state for over 35 years. The hardest thing is not knowing, Lonnie has said in interviews. If he had died, we would have grieved. We would have had a funeral. We would have found a way to accept it and move forward. But this, we're frozen in place, always wondering, always hoping. The impact on their other sons is equally profound. Growing up with a missing brother means living with constant awareness of fragility, with the knowledge that people can simply vanish. Family celebrations, birthdays, holidays, graduations, weddings are always marked by Christopher's absence. There's an empty seat at every table, a missing face in every photo. Changes in how missing persons investigations are conducted. The 24-hour rule that delayed the initial investigation has been largely abandoned. Law enforcement now recognizes that the first hours are critical, especially in cases involving teenagers. Most jurisdictions now accept missing person reports immediately, particularly when there's any indication of danger. The success of the Soul Asylum runaway train video helped establish media campaigns as a viable tool for finding missing children. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has refined its techniques for age progression and public awareness. Online communities and social media have created new avenues for keeping cold cases in the public eye, though they've also generated conspiracy theories and amateur investigation that sometimes hinders more than helps. As this story reaches its conclusion, Christopher Kerr's fate remains one of Minnesota's most enduring unsolved mysteries. Somewhere, in the dense forests of northern Minnesota, in a grave that has never been found, or perhaps in a life built on secrets and assumed identities, lies the truth of what happened on that April day in 1990. The Kerr's family continues to wait. The phone number remains active. The hope, however fragile after 35 years, remains alive. Because in the absence of proof, in the vacuum of certainty, hope is the only thing left to hold. If Christopher Kerr is still alive, he would be a middle-aged man now, potentially with children of his own who have no idea their father has a family in Minnesota still searching for him. If he died in those woods, his remains lie somewhere beneath pine needles and decades of accumulated leaf litter, waiting to be discovered by chance or providence. The truth is out there, somewhere in the space between these possibilities. And until that truth reveals itself, the Kerr's family will continue their vigil, waiting for a phone call, a knock on the door, or a notification from police that finally, after more than 3 decades, provides the answer to the question that has defined their lives. What happened to Christopher? The phone rings occasionally in the Kerr's household. Telemarketers, wrong numbers, friends and family. Each time, for just a fraction of a second, hope flickers before reality sets in. It's not him, but they answer anyway, because someday maybe it will be. And on that day, the silence that has lasted more than 30 years will finally break, and the most important word in the Kerr's family's vocabulary will finally be spoken aloud. Christopher. Until then, they wait. The forest keeps its secrets. The van has long since been sold or scrapped. The shotgun remains missing. The $200 was spent on something that will never be known. The mysterious phone calls have been silent for decades. The scent trail ended 1 mile into the woods and was never picked up again. And Christopher Kerr's, wherever he is, dead or alive, remains forever 17 in his family's hearts. Frozen in time on that April morning when he said goodbye to his mother, closed the door behind him, and vanished into a mystery that may never be solved. The case remains open. If you have any information about Christopher Kerr's, please contact the Eagan Police Department or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Vampire of Sacramento. When delusion became carnage. Blood on the kitchen floor. 3 blenders humming. Someone's organs stacked in a refrigerator like groceries. An unlocked door was all it took. 1 turn of a handle. 1 moment of trust. 1 mistake that ended 6 lives. This is the story of a predator who believed he was the prey. A man so consumed by the delusion that his blood was turning to powder, that he decided to steal the life force of strangers to survive. Sacramento, 1978. 1 month, 6 victims, and a killer who checked doorknobs the way most people check the weather, casually, methodically, hunting for invitation in suburban silence. When Richard Trenton Chase walked your neighborhood, every unlocked door whispered a promise. Every window left ajar sang an invitation. And when he found his way inside, he brought with him a hunger that defied every boundary of human comprehension. This is the account of the man they would call the Vampire of Sacramento. This is the chronicle of Richard Chase. May 23, 1950, Sacramento, California. The same city where Richard Trenton Chase would one day paint walls with the blood of innocence brought him into this world as just another baby. Another middle-class family. Another Presbyterian household trying to carve out their slice of the American dream. But inside the walls of the Chase residence, something festered. Something rotten that would seep into the bones of a child and never let go. Richard's father, Richard Edgar Chase, ruled with fists and fury. Discipline in the Chase household didn't come with explanation or compassion. Came with violence. Both Richard and his younger sister Pamela felt the sting of their father's rage throughout childhood. Their small bodies absorbing blows that should have been tempered with love. The belt, the hand. The unpredictability of a man who believed authority meant fear. Young Richard learned early that the world was hostile, that pain came from those who claimed to protect you, that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. But his father's violence was only half the equation. Beatrice Chase, Richard's mother, lived inside her own private war. She accused her husband of infidelity constantly, convinced he was poisoning her, certain that danger lurked in every corner of their home. She sought psychiatric treatment twice in the early 1960s, tormented by suspicions that clawed at her mind like hungry rats. The house echoed with their screaming matches, accusations hurled like grenades across dinner tables and through bedroom walls. Richard and Pamela became collateral damage in a marriage that rotted from the inside out. By age 10, young Richard began displaying behaviors that should have sent every alarm bell screaming through Sacramento. He started small, setting fires, watching flames dance and consume. The power of destruction fascinated him, gave him control in a life where he had none. Then came the bedwetting, night after night, sheets soaked with shame that his disciplinarian parents met with punishment rather than concern. But it was the animals that revealed the darkness growing inside him like cancer. Neighborhood cats began disappearing. Richard would hunt them, corner them, and then the screaming would start. But not just killing, studying, dissecting, exploring their insides with the curiosity of a scientist and the detachment of a psychopath. He was fascinated by their blood, by what made them work, by what happened when life drained away. The McDonald triad, fire setting, bedwetting past age 5, and animal cruelty, all present before he hit middle school. Every warning sign flashing red, and nobody paying attention. His classmates knew him as Rick. To them, he seemed normal enough in the early years. Well-groomed, decently popular, even went on dates. But the mask was thin. At 13, reality began fracturing around its edges. Richard became convinced he was a member of the James Younger Gang, a group of 19th century outlaws. He had a poster made with his face pasted onto the body of one of these gunmen. He begged his mother for a cowboy hat, certain of his identity as a desperado from another era. Beatrice dismissed it as typical teenage behavior. After all, this was the era of hippies and rebellion. What mother wanted to admit her son was losing his grip on reality. The family's financial troubles mounted. When Richard was 13, they lost their house. His parents' fighting intensified, each argument more vicious than the last. Richard retreated further into himself, into the strange rituals that gave him comfort. He would wake in the middle of the night to cook, burning pans and leaving puddles on the kitchen floor, making messes he never cleaned. His parents, too consumed with their own warfare, barely noticed their son unraveling. High school brought new torments. Richard discovered he was different from other boys in a way that filled him with shame and rage. He couldn't maintain an erection with the girls he dated. One girlfriend, Libby Christopher, stayed with him for a year, but the relationship was haunted by Richard's dysfunction. At 18, desperate for answers, he sought help from a psychiatrist who suggested his sexual problems stemmed from repressed anger. But the doctor never mentioned mental illness, never saw the abyss opening beneath this young man's feet. Richard turned to drugs with the fervor of someone seeking oblivion. Marijuana, LSD, alcohol. Anything to quiet the noise in his head, to blur the edges of a reality that felt increasingly hostile and strange. His grades plummeted. His appearance deteriorated. His hair grew long and unkempt. His hygiene suffered. Friends stopped visiting. His father noticed and blamed it on laziness and poor values, never considering that his son's brain was betraying him, that chemicals were misfiring, that delusions were taking root. At 20, Richard moved into an apartment on Annandale Lane, sharing space with two young women. They quickly learned to regret their choice of roommate. Richard rarely bathed. He never washed his clothes. He walked around naked, oblivious or uncaring about their discomfort. He stayed perpetually high, his mind floating somewhere between paranoia and dissociation. The women couldn't take it. They fled, abandoning the apartment rather than confront the increasingly disturbing young man they'd once called a friend. Richard's parents divorced in 1972. His mother took the children to Los Angeles, but Richard's father followed 8 days later, determined to bring his son back to Sacramento. The family reunited 4 months later, but nothing was resolved. Richard Sr. believed his son's problems stemmed from laziness, from a refusal to straighten up and get a job. Beatrice enabled her son's decline, making excuses, refusing to see the mental illness consuming him like wildfire. By 1975, Richard's behavior had become too bizarre to ignore. He developed hypochondria so severe it bordered on delusion. He told doctors his pulmonary artery had been stolen. He claimed his heart stopped beating. He held oranges against his head, believing vitamin C would absorb into his brain through diffusion. Most disturbing of all, he became convinced his blood was turning to powder, that his body had stopped producing this vital fluid, that he would die if he didn't find another source. In March 1975, Richard was found in a field, naked and covered in cow's blood. Police detained him briefly but released him, dismissing it as drug-related behavior. Nobody asked the right questions. Nobody saw the warning signs for what they were. A man standing on the edge of an abyss, about to drag innocence down with him. Richard was admitted to Beverly Manor Psychiatric Hospital later that year. Fellow patients nicknamed him Dracula after they caught him capturing birds through his window, snapping their necks, and drinking their blood. Staff found him extracting blood from the therapy dog and injecting it into himself with crude needles. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Finally, someone had given his madness a name. But naming a monster doesn't cage it. In 1976, against all reason and medical advice, Richard was released into his mother's care. Beatrice, believing she knew better than the professionals, weaned him off his medication. She bought him an apartment of his own. She gave her paranoid schizophrenic son independence and privacy and the opportunity to descend completely into his delusions without supervision or intervention. She handed him the keys to his own personal hell, and he took 6 innocent people with him. Richard's father paid the rent on a Cannon Street apartment and visited weekly, still believing his son just needed to try harder, to get a job, to straighten up. Richard survived on welfare, alone with his thoughts and his growing obsession with blood. He began killing small animals, blending their organs with soda, drinking the mixture he believed would keep him alive. Neighbors complained about the smell. Nobody investigated deeply enough. By late 1977, Richard Chase had descended fully into his delusions. He believed his body was actively working against him, that he was dying slowly from blood loss, that only the blood of others could save him. His apartment became a laboratory of horror. Cages for captured animals, knives for dissection, blenders for consumption. He was no longer Richard Chase, troubled young man from a broken home. He had become something else entirely, something that would soon turn its hunger toward human prey. The monster was ready. Sacramento had no idea what was coming. December 27, 1977. The sun set early over Sacramento, casting long shadows through suburban streets where families prepared for the holidays. Richard Chase climbed into his car carrying a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol he'd purchased earlier that month. His delusions whispered that he was running out of time, that his blood was crystallizing inside his veins, that he needed to act or die. That evening, he would take his obsession from animals to humans. That evening, the vampire would feed for the first time. He drove slowly through residential neighborhoods, his sunken eyes scanning houses, his emaciated frame hunched over the steering wheel. At approximately 6:30 p.m., he spotted his first target, a house with lights glowing warm against the December chill. He raised the pistol and fired at the wall as he drove past. The bullet punched through wood and drywall but struck no one. Minutes later, he fired again at a different house, this time aiming at a kitchen window. The bullet tore through the hair of Dorothy Polensky, missing her head by inches. She screamed. Her family called the police. Richard drove away into the darkness, his first attempts at murder thwarted by poor aim and random chance. 2 days later, his luck changed. December 29, 1977. Ambrose Edward Griffin, 51 years old, engineer, father of 2, had just returned from a shopping trip with his wife Carol. It was an ordinary moment, carrying grocery bags from the car, planning dinner, thinking about the week ahead. Ambrose made trips between the vehicle and his house, arms laden with purchases, unaware he had seconds left to live. Unaware that Richard Chase was driving past at that exact moment, window down, gun raised. 2 popping sounds shattered the suburban quiet. Carol heard them but didn't immediately understand. Then she heard her husband scream, watched him turn toward her with confusion and terror written across his face, watched him crumple to the ground like a puppet with severed strings. She ran to him. Blood spread across the driveway in a dark pool, steam rising from the wound in his chest into the cold December air. Ambrose Griffin died before the ambulance arrived, the first victim of a killer who believed he was killing to survive. Witnesses reported seeing a man fleeing in a vehicle, but descriptions were vague. The investigation stalled. Sacramento police had no suspects, no clear motive, no understanding that this random act of violence was just the beginning. For Richard Chase, the murder proved something crucial. He could kill. He could take what he needed. The barrier between fantasy and action had dissolved completely. But Ambrose's blood stayed inside his body, spilling onto concrete instead of into Chase's mouth. The killing hadn't satisfied the delusion's demand. Richard needed more. He needed access. He needed time. He needed to find someone vulnerable, alone, behind an unlocked door. For 3 weeks, the city breathed easier, believing the shooting was an isolated incident. But Richard was hunting, walking through neighborhoods like a predator testing territory, checking doors and windows with methodical patience. Later, he would tell investigators about his logic. A locked door meant you weren't welcome, but an unlocked door was an invitation. In Richard's fractured mind, the simple act of leaving a door unlocked was permission for him to enter, to take, to consume. The suburbs of Sacramento were full of invitations, full of people who trusted their neighbors, who didn't think twice about running out to take garbage to the curb or check the mail. That trust would cost them everything. January 23, 1978. The day dawned clear and cold. Teresa Wallen, 22 years old and 12 weeks pregnant, went about her morning routine in the home she shared with her husband David. She wore simple clothes, no reason to dress up when you're just doing housework. She gathered garbage from the kitchen, preparing to take it outside to the bin. She walked to the front door. She stepped outside into the California sunshine. She didn't lock the door behind her. Why would she? She'd be gone for 30 seconds. Richard Chase was walking the neighborhood. He saw her leave. He saw the door remain ajar. He saw his invitation. He entered the Wallen home as Teresa turned back toward the house, her task complete. She saw him in her living room, this skeletal stranger with sunken eyes and filthy clothes, holding a gun. She had no time to scream before he shot her 3 times. She fell. He watched her die. Then his delusions took complete control. David Wallen arrived home from work at approximately 6 p.m., expecting to find his wife preparing dinner, maybe rubbing her slightly swollen belly, talking to the baby they'd been planning for with such joy. Instead, he found a scene that would haunt Sacramento for decades. Teresa's body lay in their bedroom, her eyes open and fixed on nothing, her tongue protruding from her mouth in a final expression of terror. But the horror extended far beyond a simple shooting. Richard Chase had spent hours with her corpse, enacting rituals that defied sanity. He'd stabbed her repeatedly with a butcher knife from their kitchen. He'd raped her dead body. He'd mutilated her, cutting off her nipples, slicing open her abdomen, removing internal organs with the crude technique of someone more interested in access than anatomy. Blood covered the bed, the floor, the walls. Investigators found ringlet-shaped bloodstains on the hardwood floor near her body, the telltale marks of someone drinking, drops falling from a cup or mouth back onto the surface below. A yogurt container lay crushed and bloodied nearby. Richard had used it like a cup, collecting Teresa's blood and drinking it while her body cooled. He'd consumed her, taken her life force to feed the delusion that his own blood was disappearing. Nothing had been stolen from the house. No jewelry, no electronics, no cash. But body parts were missing. Richard had taken trophies, pieces of Teresa, to bring back to his apartment laboratory. When police searched the neighborhood, they discovered more disturbing evidence. A nearby home had been burglarized. Inside, they found the disemboweled remains of a dog, its organs removed with the same crude technique used on Teresa. Richard had been practicing, perfecting his method, preparing for his next hunt. David Wallen's screams brought neighbors running. The peaceful suburb transformed into a crime scene, patrol cars and ambulances converging with sirens that shattered the evening quiet. Detectives worked through the night, photographing, collecting evidence, trying to understand what kind of person could do this to another human being, to a pregnant woman, to someone guilty of nothing except leaving her door unlocked for half a minute. The FBI was called in. Special Agent Russell Vorpagel contacted Virginia-based profiler Robert Ressler, one of the pioneers of criminal profiling. Together, they analyzed the crime scene and began building a picture of the killer. Their profile was chillingly accurate. White male, age 25 to 27, thin and malnourished appearance, single, living alone within a mile of the crime scene, history of mental illness and drug use, unemployed loner who spent most of his time in his residence, no military service, high school or college dropout, suffering from paranoid psychosis. They knew they were hunting someone profoundly disturbed, someone for whom the murder itself was secondary to the mutilation and consumption that followed. They knew he would strike again. What they didn't know was how soon, or how many more would die before they caught him. Richard Chase returned to his apartment that night, organs and blood samples secured in bags. His delusion temporarily satisfied. He'd proven he could enter homes, could take what he needed, could feed the hunger that consumed him. His apartment, already filthy and rank with the smell of decomposing animals, became a processing center for human remains. The blenders hummed. The refrigerator stored its horrific contents. The calendar on his wall had one word written on January 23rd. Today, Sacramento's nightmare had only just begun. The vampire had tasted human blood, and his appetite was insatiable. January 27th, 1978. For days after Teresa Wallen's murder. For days of Sacramento police working around the clock, chasing leads that went nowhere, warning residents to lock their doors and watch for suspicious activity. For days of Richard Chase planning his next hunt, driven by delusions that insisted he needed more blood, more organs, more life force to replace what his body refused to produce. For days before he would commit the most savage massacre Sacramento had ever witnessed. That morning dawned with the casual normalcy that precedes every tragedy. People woke, made coffee, prepared for ordinary Fridays filled with work and school and weekend plans. At 3207 Marywood Drive, 38-year-old Evelyn Miroth prepared to babysit her 22-month-old nephew, David Ferreira. Her 6-year-old son Jason played in another room, his laughter the soundtrack to a morning that would end in silence. Daniel Meredith, 52 years old and Jason's godfather, had stopped by to visit, perhaps to share coffee and conversation with his longtime friend Evelyn. None of them knew they had hours left to live. None of them knew that less than a mile away, Richard Chase was loading his gun and preparing to hunt. But before the massacre, there was Robert Edwards. That same morning, Edwards was home when he heard the distinct sound of his front door opening. He went to investigate and found Richard Chase standing inside his house, this emaciated figure with hollow eyes, holding objects that belonged to Edwards, as if he had every right to be there. Edwards reacted instantly, chasing the intruder out of his home, watching him run to a red station wagon and drive away. Edwards called the police immediately. He gave a description. They took notes. And then Richard Chase disappeared into Sacramento's sprawling suburbs, headed for Marywood Drive. Later, at a shopping center near the Miroth home, Nancy Holder was browsing through stores when a figure approached her. She'd gone to high school with Richard Chase years ago, knew him when he was clean-cut Rick, the kid who seemed normal enough despite being a little odd. But the man standing before her now was unrecognizable. His eyes had sunken into dark hollows. His frame was skeletal, clothing hanging off bones like fabric on a scarecrow. Blood stained his sweatshirt in dark, damning patches. "Were you on the motorcycle when Kurt was killed?" he asked, referencing her boyfriend from a decade ago. Dead in an accident Richard couldn't possibly have known about unless he'd been obsessing over old yearbooks and neighborhood tragedies. Nancy felt ice slide down her spine. Something was wrong with this man, something beyond drugs or mental illness. He radiated danger the way corpses radiate decay. She mumbled an excuse and walked quickly to her car, watching him in her peripheral vision as he paid for something in the store. She drove away fast, hands shaking on the wheel, unable to shake the feeling that she'd just escaped something terrible. Richard Chase left the shopping center and parked nearby, then walked to Marywood Drive. He tested doorknobs the way other people test the temperature of bathwater, casually, methodically, without emotion. Most doors were locked, their inhabitants safe behind deadbolts and common sense. But Evelyn Myratha's door turned easily under his hand. Invitation accepted. He entered with his gun drawn. Daniel Meredith was in the front room, perhaps reading or watching television, unaware that death had just walked through the unlocked door. Richard shot him in the head at close range. The sound would have echoed through the house. A crack that announced slaughter, that sent panic racing through the bloodstream of everyone who heard it. But there was no time to run, no time to call for help, no time for anything except the brutal efficiency of Richard's execution. Jason Miroth, 6 years old, was found in his mother's bedroom. He'd been shot twice in the head. His small body crumpled on the floor opposite his mother's bed. Perhaps he'd run when he heard the first shot. Perhaps he'd cried out for his mother. Perhaps Richard simply eliminated him as a witness, as an obstacle, as someone whose blood and organs might also serve his delusion's demands. Evelyn Miroth died last. The crime scene would reveal that Richard spent the most time with her, enacting horrors that exceeded even Teresa Wallen's murder in their depravity. He shot her, then subjected her corpse to violation and mutilation that defied every boundary of human decency. He raped her with a knife, the blade tearing through dead flesh in a parody of sexual violence. He opened her abdominal cavity with crude, slashing cuts, removing organs with the enthusiasm of a child opening presents and the skill of a butcher's apprentice. The bathroom became a processing station. He filled the bathtub with bloody water, washing himself, washing his tools, leaving crimson smears on white porcelain like obscene art. The walls and floor ran red with blood from multiple victims, trails leading from body to body like a map of his movements through the house. He consumed blood directly from Evelyn's body, drinking as if at a fountain, letting it run down his chin and chest, finally satisfying the delusion that had driven him to this moment of absolute madness. But David Ferreira, the 22-month-old baby, was nowhere to be found in the house. His playpen sat in Evelyn's room, covered in blood, containing a pillow with a bullet hole punched through its center. Richard had taken the baby. Why? Perhaps as a trophy, perhaps for later consumption, perhaps because in his fractured mind, the child represented life force in its purest form. He'd carried David's small body out of the house, placed it in Daniel Meredith's red station wagon, and driven away with his youngest victim tucked beside him like luggage. The scene Richard left behind was beyond comprehension. Bloody footprints tracked through every room, evidence of his casual wandering through the house after the murders, unrushed and unconcerned. Investigators would later determine he'd spent at least an hour in the Miroth home, plenty of time to be thorough in his butchery, plenty of time for the terror and violence to play out in excruciating detail. A neighbor discovered the massacre at approximately 12:30 p.m. when she came to check on Evelyn and found the front door slightly ajar. She called out. No answer. She pushed the door open wider and saw Daniel Meredith's body in the front room, his head destroyed by the bullet that killed him. Blood pooled beneath him in congealing darkness. She screamed and ran, calling the police with shaking hands, her voice barely coherent as she tried to explain what she'd seen. The police response was massive. Detectives, forensics teams, FBI agents. They all converged on Marywood Drive, setting up a perimeter around the house, keeping gathering crowds at bay. Inside, they documented 4 deaths and 1 missing baby, evidence of necrophilia and cannibalism, signs of a killer who had descended so far into madness that he'd become something other than human. The investigators, hardened by years of homicide work, left the scene shaken. This wasn't just murder. This was a descent into hell made manifest in a suburban home. Daniel Meredith's red station wagon was found abandoned a few blocks away, engine still running, keys in the ignition. Richard had fled in haste after spending an hour in casual butchery, perhaps finally spooked by the realization that someone might come looking, that his time was running out. But the wagon's location was crucial. It was discovered just a few hundred yards from Richard Chase's apartment, a proximity that would soon crack the case wide open. An 11-year-old girl who lived nearby came forward with a description of a strange man she'd seen around the Miroth home that morning. Her account matched Robert Edwards's description of the intruder in his house. It matched the FBI profile. It matched Nancy Holder's encounter at the shopping center. The pieces were falling into place, the net tightening, the hunter about to become the hunted. That evening, as news of the quadruple homicide spread through Sacramento, the city transformed into a landscape of locked doors and drawn curtains, paranoia infecting every resident like a virus. Parents kept children inside. Gun sales skyrocketed. Neighborhood watch groups formed overnight. Everyone was checking their doors, their windows, their locks. The vampire had proven he could enter any home, kill anyone, take what he wanted without remorse or hesitation. Trust, that fundamental presumption that our neighbors mean us no harm, evaporated like water under the merciless sun. Richard Chase sat in his apartment that night surrounded by the evidence of his crimes. Blood in the blenders, organs in the refrigerator, the calendar with today, marked on both murder dates. Baby David Ferreira's body was no longer with him. He disposed of it somewhere between the murder scene and his apartment, though police wouldn't discover its location for months. He'd taken what he needed, fed the delusion one more time, and now he waited in his filthy apartment for whatever came next. What came next was Nancy Holder picking up the phone, her hands still shaking from the encounter at the shopping center. She'd seen the news. She'd heard the descriptions. She'd recognized the orange parka that Richard had been wearing, the same orange parka witnesses described at the Miroth scene. She made the call that would end Richard Chase's reign of terror, her voice steady as she told investigators exactly who they were looking for. The vampire had made a mistake. He'd shown his face to someone who remembered him, who put the pieces together, who cared enough about stopping the killing to come forward. The hunt was almost over. January 28, 1978, one day after the Marywood Drive massacre. Sacramento police and FBI agents received Nancy Holder's call identifying Richard Trenton Chase as the suspect. Investigators immediately ran a background check and discovered details that made their blood run cold. Chase lived within 1 mile of multiple crime scenes, had a registered .22 caliber handgun in his name, had a history of psychiatric hospitalizations and bizarre behavior. He matched their profile in every particular. They'd found their vampire. Detectives moved quickly to establish surveillance on Chase's apartment while they secured warrants. They couldn't risk waiting, couldn't afford another moment of delay that might give him time to kill again. Officers positioned themselves with views of the building's exits, watching for any movement, ready to move if their target tried to flee. The apartment building sat in a quiet complex, its other residents oblivious to the monster living among them, to the horror that had been fermenting behind one particular locked door. Inside that apartment, Richard Chase went about his routines as if the world wasn't closing in around him. He blended animal organs with blood and soda, drinking the mixture he believed kept him alive. He arranged his trophies from the murders, pieces of his victims stored in containers, kept close like sacred relics. His calendar hung on the wall with its damning notations. His 3 blenders sat on the counter, residue of blood dried in their containers. The refrigerator held dishes containing human body parts, stored alongside spoiled food in a grotesque pantry. He was living inside his delusions completely now, the outside world reduced to a hunting ground for the blood and organs his fractured mind insisted he needed. The warrant came through. Officers prepared to execute the arrest with overwhelming force. Richard was armed, dangerous, and completely unpredictable. They knew from the crime scenes that he was capable of extreme violence, that he wouldn't hesitate to kill if cornered. The takedown had to be fast and decisive, no room for error, no opportunity for him to barricade himself inside or take a hostage or go down fighting. Late afternoon, January 28th. Officers approached the apartment door and knocked, announcing their presence. No response. They heard movement inside, footsteps, the sound of someone trying to hide or destroy evidence. They positioned themselves, ready to breach if necessary. Minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Then the door opened. Richard Chase stepped out, blinking in the California sunlight like a nocturnal creature caught in the open. He looked exactly as the profiles and witness descriptions suggested. Emaciated, with sunken eyes and filthy clothes, blood stains visible on his shirt even from a distance. Officers moved immediately, tackling him to the ground before he could react, securing his hands behind his back with practiced efficiency. He offered no resistance, his body going limp as if some animating force had suddenly departed, leaving only an empty shell. Inside the apartment, investigators discovered a chamber of horrors that exceeded even their worst expectations. The smell hit them first. Decay and blood and unwashed human combined into an odor that made seasoned officers gag. 3 blenders on the counter contained traces of blood, some still fresh enough to identify. The refrigerator yielded its terrible secrets. Dishes containing human organs, body parts arranged with the casual organization of someone storing leftovers. A 12-inch butcher knife lay on the counter, blood dried in the grooves of the blade. Animal collars hung on hooks, trophies from pets Chase had stolen and butchered. Cages contained the remains of small animals in various stages of decomposition. Rubber boots stood by the door, their soles caked with dried blood that investigators would later match to the crime scenes. And there, hanging on the wall in plain sight, was the calendar with today marked on January 23rd and January 27th, the dates of Teresa Wallen's murder and the Marywood Drive massacre. Richard had documented his kills like someone marking important appointments, mixing murder in with the mundane routines of daily life. The registered .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol was recovered from the apartment. Ballistics testing would confirm it as the murder weapon in all 6 killings. Every piece of evidence they needed was there, laid out in Richard's apartment like exhibits in a museum of human depravity. But baby David Ferreira was still missing. Investigators interrogated Richard about the infant's location, and eventually he revealed what he'd done. David's small body was found weeks later, decapitated and mummified, left in a box in a vacant lot not far from Chase's apartment. The baby's brain had been among the trophies in Richard's refrigerator, preserved like a specimen in a laboratory. The discovery devastated the infant's family, robbed them of even the small comfort of a complete body to bury. The trial began January 2nd, 1979. Richard Chase pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, his defense attorneys arguing that his profound mental illness rendered him incapable of understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. Psychiatrists testified about his paranoid schizophrenia, his delusions about his blood turning to powder, his absolute conviction that he was killing to survive. The defense painted a picture of a man so divorced from reality that he couldn't be held legally responsible for his crimes. The prosecution disagreed. They argued that Richard knew his actions were wrong. He'd hidden from police, he'd checked to see if doors were locked before entering, demonstrating he understood the concept of permission and trespass. He'd fled from crime scenes, He tried to destroy evidence. These were not the actions of someone incapable of understanding wrongfulness. These were the actions of someone who killed for gratification and tried to justify it with delusions. During the trial, Richard testified in his own defense. He admitted to the murders but claimed to have no memory of all the details. He said he'd been in a semi-conscious state during the Teresa Wallen killing, that he didn't see Ambrose Griffin before shooting him, that he'd originally planned to target someone else before entering the Miroth residence. His testimony was rambling, disjointed, filled with references to his delusions about blood and poisoning and conspiracy. He spoke about killing as if discussing grocery shopping, necessary, routine, unremarkable. The prosecutor, Ronald Tochterman, delivered a devastating summation. He argued that mental illness didn't absolve someone of legal responsibility, that understanding Richard's psychological deterioration didn't change the fundamental fact that he'd murdered 6 people, including a pregnant woman and a baby. He reminded the jury of the terror these victims experienced, the violation of their homes and bodies, the families destroyed by Richard's actions. The jury deliberated and reached their verdict: guilty on all 6 counts of first-degree murder. They ruled that Richard Chase was legally sane at the time of the crimes, capable of understanding right from wrong even if his reasons for killing stemmed from delusional beliefs. On May 8, 1979, he was sentenced to death. The courtroom erupted in approval. Families of victims wept with relief and rage. Richard showed no emotion, his face blank as the judge sealed his fate. Richard Chase was sent to San Quentin State Prison's death row, where he joined the ranks of California's condemned. But he wouldn't stay there long. Almost immediately, he began hoarding his antidepressant medication instead of taking it. Fellow inmates watched him pocket pills during medication distribution, squirreling them away like treasure. Guards missed it or didn't care enough to intervene. Richard was planning his final escape, the one act of control he had left. On December 26, 1980, just 19 months after his conviction, Richard Trenton Chase was found dead in his cell. He'd overdosed on the antidepressants he'd been stockpiling, taking enough to ensure there was no coming back, no resuscitation, no forced continuation of a life that had become unendurable even to him. He was 30 years old. His death was ruled suicide, though some speculated about the possibility of murder by other inmates who knew what he'd done, who believed child killers deserved their own form of justice. The reaction to his death was mixed. Victim families felt cheated of closure, of watching him spend decades on death row, of knowing he suffered the consequences of his actions for as long as possible. Others felt relief that he could never kill again, never be released on a technicality, never escape his cage and return to hunting the neighborhoods of Sacramento. The autopsies revealed the full extent of Richard's crimes. Teresa Wallen had been stabbed multiple times post-mortem, her organs harvested with crude brutality. Evelyn Myratha's body showed evidence of the most extensive mutilation, over a dozen stab wounds, internal organs removed, evidence of cannibalism that forensic pathologists documented with clinical detachment while horror crept up their spines. Jason Miroth and Daniel Meredith had been execution-style killings, quick shots to the head that ended their lives before terror could fully register. Baby David's decapitated body told its own story of unimaginable cruelty, a child who never had the chance to understand danger before it consumed him. Investigators traced Richard's movements in the days and weeks before his arrest. Neighbors reported seeing him wandering through alleys, peering into windows, testing doors at odd hours. One woman recalled watching him check every door on her street one afternoon, methodically moving from house to house like a salesman making rounds. She'd found it strange but not threatening enough to call police. That failure to act haunted her after the murders came to light. The psychological community studied Richard's case extensively, adding him to the small but terrifying category of vampiric killers, murderers who consume their victims' blood out of psychotic delusion or paraphilia. Dr. Joel Norris, who interviewed Richard extensively before his death, described him as one of the most profoundly disturbed individuals he'd encountered in decades of studying criminal psychology. Richard's delusions weren't mere justifications for violence. They were his entire reality, an alternate universe where drinking blood was survival rather than atrocity. Richard's mother Beatrice faced intense scrutiny and blame after the murders. Critics pointed to her decision to remove him from medication, to set him up in an apartment alone, to ignore warning signs that would have been obvious to anyone paying attention. She defended her actions until her death, insisting she'd done what she thought was best, that she couldn't have predicted the violence, that Richard had seemed fine without the medication. Her denial was absolute, a wall she built around herself to keep out the crushing guilt of enabling 6 murders through willful blindness and maternal delusion. His father, Richard Sr., rarely spoke publicly about his son's crimes. When he did, it was to distance himself, to emphasize that he tried to instill discipline and values, that his son's failures were not reflections of his parenting. The violence he'd inflicted on young Richard, the rage-filled household he'd helped create, these things remained unexamined, buried beneath justifications and deflections. Both parents carried blame, but neither would fully accept it. The city of Sacramento changed after Richard Chase. Door locking became obsessive. Neighborhoods that once left windows open for crossbreezes now sealed themselves behind deadbolts and security systems. The casual trust that marks healthy communities evaporated, replaced by wariness that persists decades later. Older residents still remember the fear, still check their locks multiple times, still glance over their shoulders when walking alone at dusk. The families of victims rebuilt their lives as best they could, carrying grief that never fully heals. David Wallen remarried eventually but never had another child, unable to replace the wife and unborn baby stolen from him in those horrific minutes. The Ferreira family fractured under the weight of losing baby David, his parents' marriage dissolving as they each struggled with trauma too heavy to share. Daniel Meredith's family grappled with the randomness of his death. Wrong place, wrong time, killed simply for being present when a monster came calling. Evelyn Myertha's extended family tried to preserve Jason's memory, speaking of the bright 6-year-old boy who loved dinosaurs and playing outside, who never got the chance to grow up and discover what he might become. They refused to let his identity be subsumed by the violence of his death, insisted on remembering the life rather than dwelling on the murder. But the horror of how he died, how his mother died, shadowed every memory and turned every photograph into a memorial to what could have been. Ambrose Griffin's death, the first murder, the one that proved Richard could kill, haunted investigators who wondered if faster action could have stopped the subsequent massacres. If they'd taken the shooting more seriously, if they'd connected it to the earlier incidents of random gunfire at houses, if they'd increased patrols in the area, could Teresa Wallen have survived? Could the Marywood Drive victims have celebrated more birthdays? The what-ifs pile up like cordwood, heavy and useless, changing nothing but weighing on everyone who touched the case. Robert Ressler, the FBI profiler who helped create the psychological profile that led to Richard's capture, later wrote about the case in his books on criminal psychology. He described Richard as a textbook example of disorganized serial killing driven by psychosis rather than sexual sadism or power fantasies. The randomness of victim selection, the extreme mutilation, the cannibalism, all pointed to someone operating under profound delusion rather than calculated evil. Not that the distinction mattered to the dead or their families. The case influenced changes in mental health law and policy. Richard's release from psychiatric care despite clear evidence of dangerous psychosis sparked debates about involuntary commitment, about patients' rights versus public safety, about when family members should be allowed to make medication decisions for mentally ill adults. Some states strengthened laws allowing forced treatment for individuals deemed dangers to themselves or others. Whether these changes prevented future Richards from slipping through cracks in the system remains an open question. Richard's apartment building became infamous, a landmark of horror that nobody wanted to acknowledge. The unit where he lived remained vacant for years, landlords unable to find tenants willing to sleep where a vampire had stored body parts in the refrigerator. Eventually, the building was renovated and the unit number changed, an attempt to erase history through cosmetic alterations. Current residents likely have no idea of the atrocities that occurred within their walls, the blood that soaked into floorboards since removed and replaced. The weapons and evidence from the case remain in police custody, stored in evidence rooms alongside thousands of other artifacts from Sacramento's criminal history. The blenders, the knife, the calendar with its damning notations. All sealed in boxes, cataloged and forgotten, except when researchers or journalists request access for documentaries or true crime retrospectives. Richard's .22 caliber pistol, the tool that ended 6 lives, sits in an evidence locker gathering dust, a piece of metal that became an instrument of terror in the hands of madness. True crime enthusiasts study the case obsessively, analyzing Richard's psychology, debating whether he could have been stopped, arguing about the role of nature versus nurture in creating a monster. Online forums dissect every detail of the murders, sometimes with respectful curiosity, sometimes with ghoulish fascination that borders on fetishization. The victims become footnotes in these discussions, their humanity reduced to body counts and crime scene photographs, their lives matching less than the killer's twisted motivations. But in Sacramento, among people who lived through the terror of January 1978, the memory remains raw. They remember the fear that gripped the city, the panic that made children sleep in their parents' rooms and caused families to arm themselves. They remember checking on elderly neighbors, forming spontaneous community watch groups, looking at strangers with suspicion that had never existed before. They remember when trust died, when suburban safety revealed itself as illusion, when an unlocked door became an invitation to slaughter. The legacy of Richard Trenton Chase is written in locked doors and security systems, in hypervigilance passed down through generations, in trauma that ripples outward from the epicenter of violence like waves from a stone thrown into still water. He killed 6 people in 1 month, but his impact extends far beyond those immediate victims to touch everyone who heard the story, everyone who checked their locks one more time before bed, everyone who understood in their bones that monsters are real and sometimes they walk through unlocked doors looking for blood. Richard Chase proved that delusion and reality can merge into something catastrophic, that untreated mental illness combined with access to weapons and privacy creates conditions for atrocity. He demonstrated that warning signs, even obvious, glaring, impossible to miss warning signs, mean nothing if nobody acts on them. He showed Sacramento and the world that the price of inattention, of looking away, of making excuses for dangerous behavior, is paid in blood by the innocent. And so his story endures, retold in documentaries and books and podcasts, examined by psychologists and criminologists, whispered as cautionary tale by parents teaching children about danger. The vampire of Sacramento lives on in collective memory, a reminder that horror doesn't require supernatural elements or gothic castles. Sometimes it just requires a broken mind, an unlocked door, and the catastrophic convergence of opportunity and madness. Richard Chase died alone in a prison cell, choking down pills that would end his suffering and rob his victims' families of satisfaction. His body was cremated. His ashes were scattered in an unmarked location, no memorial to mark his existence, no grave for people to curse or vandalize. He left this world as he lived in it, disconnected, isolated, consumed by delusions that destroyed not just himself but everyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. The 6 victims, Ambrose Griffin, Teresa Wallen and her unborn child, Evelyn Miroth, Jason Miroth, Daniel Meredith, and baby David Ferreira are remembered. Their names are spoken. Their lives, cut brutally short, are honored by those who love them and those who simply refuse to let them be forgotten. They deserved so much more than they got. They deserved to live, to age, to experience all the ordinary moments that string together to make a life meaningful. Instead, they got terror and pain and death at the hands of someone who saw them not as people but as resources, not as humans but as vessels containing what he needed to survive his delusions. This is the story of the vampire of Sacramento. This is the chronicle of Richard Trenton Chase and the month when evil walked through unlocked doors and fed on innocence. This is the reminder that safety is never guaranteed, that trust must be balanced with caution, that vigilance is the price we pay for living in a world where monsters sometimes wear human faces and knock on human doors. Lock your doors. Check your windows. Trust carefully. And remember the victims, always the victims, because they paid the ultimate price for one man's descent into madness and one community's failure to stop him before blood ran through suburban streets. The vampire is dead, but the scars remain forever. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.